Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in October 2023. In the White Mountain National Forest of New Hampshire, near the abandoned settlement of Livermore. I should have listened to the weather warnings. Should have paid attention to the locals in North Conway who went quiet when we mentioned our destination. Should have turned back when our GPS started glitching before we even reached the trailhead. But hindsight is a luxury for the living, and I'm not entirely sure I qualify anymore. It was supposed to be a simple 4-day backpacking trip. Me, Sarah Rodriguez, Kevin King, and Amanda Wright. We'd been friends since college, and this annual October trip had become our tradition. Sarah, ever the planner, had mapped out a route through the Pemigewasset wilderness that would take us to some of the more remote peaks. Kevin, our eternal optimist, had packed enough energy bars to feed a small army. Amanda, quiet but fiercely loyal, carried the first aid kit and enough survival gear to make a Navy SEAL jealous. The first sign something was wrong came at the Kankamagus Scenic Byway. Our phones, all fully charged that morning, began dying simultaneously. Not gradually, they just stopped. Sarah's iPhone went from 87% to dead in the span of checking our location twice. Kevin laughed it off, making jokes about government conspiracies and alien interference. Amanda frowned but said nothing, though I caught her checking her backup battery pack for the third time. "Probably just the altitude," I said, though we weren't even that high yet. "Mountain interference or something." The GPS in my car stuttered, showing us in 3 different locations within the span of 5 minutes. According to the screen, we were simultaneously in Lincoln, Conway, and somehow underwater in the middle of Squam Lake. Sarah pulled out her physical map. Thank God for her preparedness, and we navigated the old-fashioned way to the Oliverian Brook Trail parking area. The lot was empty except for a rusted pickup truck that looked like it hadn't moved in years. Moss grew through its wheel wells, and one window was spiderwebbed with cracks. A park ranger should have been checking permits, but the station stood vacant, its windows dark and somehow watching. "Creepy," Amanda murmured, adjusting her pack straps. She was right. The silence felt oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. We signed the trail register, noting we were the first entries in over 2 weeks. Kevin made a joke about having the wilderness to ourselves, but his laugh sounded forced. The pen I used to sign leaked thick, dark ink that looked almost black in the dim afternoon light. The trail started innocuously enough, a gentle incline through mixed hardwoods painted in October's fire. Maples blazed red and orange, birches dropped golden coins at our feet, and the air carried that clean, crisp scent of autumn decay. For the first hour, it felt like every other hiking trip we'd taken. Then the sound stopped. It wasn't gradual. One moment we were walking through a symphony of rustling leaves, distant bird calls, and the occasional chatter of squirrels. The next, we were moving through absolute silence. Our footsteps seemed to echo wrong, too sharp and somehow muffled at the same time. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kevin stopped walking entirely. "Where are all the animals?" We stood there listening, straining for any sound of life. Nothing. Not even wind through the trees, though I could see the branches moving overhead. The silence pressed against my eardrums like I was underwater. Amanda broke the spell by shouldering her pack and starting forward again. "Probably just scared them off," she said, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her hiking poles. The trail markers became increasingly sporadic. What should have been blue blazes marking our route appeared sporadically, sometimes painted on trees that looked too young to have been marked years ago, sometimes carved so deep into bark that the wood had bled dark sap like wounds. Once, I swear, I saw a blaze that looked red instead of blue, but when I pointed it out to the others, it was gone. By evening, we'd made good time to our planned campsite near a small creek about 6 miles in. The spot was perfect. A flat area surrounded by large boulders that would provide wind protection, with running water nearby. But something felt off about the place. The rocks were arranged too purposefully like ancient monuments. Thin lines had been scratched into some of them, marks that looked almost like symbols or runes. "Probably just geological formations," Sarah said when I mentioned it, but she chose to set up her tent on the far side of camp. We gathered wood as the sun set, though it seemed to disappear faster than it should have. Kevin and I ventured into the darkening forest while the girls set up camp. The silence followed us, broken only by the crack of branches underfoot and our increasingly labored breathing. "Mike," Kevin said suddenly, his voice tight, "look at this." He was standing beside a large oak tree, pointing at its trunk. Deep gouges ran vertically down the bark, far too high and too large to be made by any normal forest animal. They were fresh. White wood showed through the tears, and sap still wept from the wounds. "Bear," I suggested, though I knew it wasn't right. The marks were too precise, too deliberate, and they went up nearly 15 feet. Kevin touched one of the gouges, and his finger came away sticky with something that wasn't quite sap. It was darker, more viscous, and it smelled like copper and decay. We gathered our wood quickly after that and hurried back to camp. Amanda had gotten a fire started, and the cheerful orange light felt like a barrier against the pressing darkness. We cooked our dinner in relative normalcy, dehydrated camping meals that tasted like cardboard but filled our stomachs. For a while, as we sat around the fire sharing stories and passing around Kevin's flask of whiskey, things felt almost normal. Then our fire started acting strange. It began as flickers of blue and green mixed in with the orange flames. Pretty, almost. Sarah mentioned it first, pointing out how the colors danced differently than usual. But as the night wore on, the fire's behavior became increasingly erratic. The flames would suddenly leap higher without additional fuel, or die down to coals despite plenty of wood. The smoke, instead of rising straight up in the still air, began to spiral and twist in impossible patterns. "Probably just minerals in the wood," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Different trees burn different colors. Around midnight, Kevin volunteered to bank the fire and check our food storage. He was always the responsible one on these trips, the guy who made sure we followed leave-no-trace principles and kept a clean camp. He walked into the darkness beyond our firelight carrying a flashlight, humming quietly to himself. We waited for him to return. 5 minutes passed, then 10. "Kevin?" Sarah called out. No response. Amanda stood up, her hand already reaching for the powerful headlamp she always carried. "He probably just went further than planned. You know how he gets, sees something interesting and follows it." But 15 minutes became 30, and 30 became an hour. We called his name until our voices were hoarse, ventured into the woods with our flashlights, followed the creek both upstream and down. Nothing. Kevin King had simply vanished into the white mountain darkness. We spent the rest of the night awake, feeding the fire and calling periodically for our missing friend. As dawn approached, exhaustion and terror had us jumping at every shadow. We'd decided to hike out and get help when we heard footsteps approaching through the morning mist. Kevin emerged from the tree line, walking slowly and deliberately toward our camp. Relief flooded through me so powerfully I almost collapsed. "Jesus Christ, Kevin! Where the hell were you?" Sarah ran toward him, but stopped short when she got a good look at his face. He was smiling. Not the easy, infectious grin we all knew, but something wider and more fixed. His eyes seemed unfocused, looking slightly past us rather than at us. His clothes were torn and dirty, as if he'd spent the night crawling through underbrush, but his skin was clean. Too clean. "I went to gather wood," he said in a voice that sounded like Kevin's but somehow wasn't quite right. The cadence was off, the inflection strange. "I got lost." "We called for you all night," Amanda said carefully. "Where were you?" Kevin's smile widened further, showing too much gum. "I was gathering wood." He was carrying firewood, armloads of perfectly straight branches that looked like they'd been broken, not cut. They were all exactly the same length, arranged with unnatural precision. As he walked closer, I noticed his fingernails. They were caked with dirt and something darker, and they'd grown longer. Much longer. They looked almost like claws. "Kevin, are you okay?" I asked. "You look different." His head turned toward me with a sharp, bird-like motion. "I'm fine, Mike. Never been better. I found exactly what I was looking for." The way he said my name made my skin crawl. It was like he was tasting it, rolling it around his mouth before speaking it. We broke camp quickly, all of us eager to get moving. Kevin's behavior had put everyone on edge, though nobody wanted to voice their concerns directly. He moved differently now, too fluid, like his joints had been redesigned. When he thought we weren't looking, I caught him staring at us with an intensity that made my stomach clench. The trail seemed to shift around us as we hiked. Blazes appeared and disappeared. Paths we'd taken the day before no longer existed, replaced by impenetrable walls of undergrowth. Sarah's map showed us in impossible locations, sometimes miles from where we'd camped, sometimes in areas that didn't match the terrain around us at all. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah muttered, turning the map upside down and back again. "According to this, we should be on a ridgeline, but we're clearly in a valley." Kevin laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Maps lie, Sarah. You can't trust them in places like this." "Places like what?" Amanda asked. "Old places, hungry places." Kevin's smile never wavered, but something moved behind his eyes, something alien and cold. We stopped for lunch at what should have been a scenic overlook, but instead found ourselves in a grove of dead trees. The trunks were blackened and twisted, reaching toward the overcast sky like charred fingers. The ground beneath them was bare of vegetation, just dark soil that seemed to absorb our footsteps without echo. As we ate our sandwiches in uncomfortable silence, I noticed Kevin wasn't eating. He held his food and moved it around, but I never saw him take a bite. When I mentioned it, he claimed he'd already eaten. His pack, when he opened it to retrieve something, was full of that strange, precisely cut firewood instead of a camping gear. "Kevin, where's your sleeping bag?" Amanda asked. "Your clothes, your food." "I don't need them anymore," he replied simply. "I have everything I need." That afternoon, the temperature began to drop precipitously. What had started as a comfortable autumn day plunged toward freezing. Our breath misted in the air, and I could feel the cold seeping through my layers. But Kevin seemed unaffected. If anything, he appeared more energetic as the temperature fell. The sun disappeared behind thick clouds that seemed to press down on us like a ceiling. The forest grew darker despite it being mid-afternoon. Amanda broke out her headlamp, and the beam seemed weak and ineffective, as if the darkness was actively fighting against it. "We need to find shelter," Sarah said, checking her watch for the third time. "It's only 2 o'clock, but it feels like evening." Kevin turned that unsettling smile on her. "Time works differently here, Sarah. Don't you feel it? How the hours stretch and compress. How yesterday feels like it was years ago." He was right, and that terrified me more than anything else that had happened. The normal rhythms of day and night, of time itself, seemed disrupted. Minutes stretched into hours, while hours collapsed into seconds. My watch had stopped working entirely, its hands frozen at 3:33. We found what looked like an old shelter, a lean-to that appeared suddenly in a clearing we definitely hadn't seen before. It was constructed from branches and bark, but the craftsmanship was too precise, too deliberate to be random forest debris. Symbols were carved into the wooden frame, similar to what we'd seen on the rocks the night before. "I don't like this," Amanda whispered to me as we approached. "None of this is on the map. This shelter shouldn't exist." But it was getting dark rapidly, and the temperature continued to plummet. We didn't have much choice. As we set up our minimal camp inside the shelter, Kevin wandered off again. This time, we watched him go. He walked into the forest with that fluid, wrong gait, and the darkness seemed to part for him like water. "We need to talk," Sarah said once he was out of earshot. "Something's wrong with Kevin. Really wrong." Amanda nodded grimly. "That's not Kevin. I don't know what it is, but it's not him." "What are you talking about?" I asked, though deep down I knew they were right. "It's Kevin. He just got lost, got scared. People react differently to stress." "People don't grow claws overnight," Sarah hissed. "People don't smile like that. And did you notice he hasn't blinked? Not once since he came back this morning." She was right. In all our hours of hiking and conversation, I hadn't seen Kevin blink a single time. His eyes remained wide and staring, unblinking as a snake's. "So what do we do?" Amanda asked. "Leave him here. He's our friend." "That thing is not our friend," Sarah said flatly. "I don't know what happened to the real Kevin, but that's not him." Kevin returned as full darkness fell, carrying more of that strange wood. The pieces were charred now, as if they'd been burned but somehow remained intact. He arranged them in a precise pattern around our shelter, not for a fire, but in a design that hurt to look at directly. The blackened wood seemed to absorb light, creating patches of absolute darkness that my eyes couldn't penetrate. "Kevin, what are you doing?" I asked. "Preparing," he said without turning around. "They'll come tonight. They always come when the hunger is strong." "Who will come?" "Kevin, you're not making sense." He finished his arrangement and stood up slowly. When he turned around, his face had changed again. His features were sharper, more angular. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and dark veins were visible beneath the surface. But his smile remained constant. That horrible, too-wide grin that showed teeth that seemed longer and more pointed than before. "The others," he said. "The ones who've been waiting. The ones who know what this place really is." "What place?" Amanda demanded. "What are you talking about?" Kevin tilted his head at an impossible angle, like an owl. "Livermore, Amanda. Don't you know where you are? This is Livermore." The name hit me like a physical blow. Livermore was a ghost town, an abandoned logging settlement deep in the White Mountains. But it had been uninhabited for over a century, and according to our map, we were still miles away from its location. "That's impossible," Sarah said. "Livermore is 30 miles north of here. Distance means nothing here," Kevin replied. "This is where they brought them. The workers, the families. This is where they were consumed." As if summoned by his words, we began to hear sounds from the darkness beyond our shelter. Footsteps, whispers, the crack of branches under weight. But when we shined our flashlights into the forest, nothing was there. Kevin stood at the edge of our shelter, swaying slightly as if moved by a wind we couldn't feel. "Can you hear them? They're singing. Such beautiful songs about hunger and satisfaction." I strained to listen and caught something. A low, rhythmic sound that might have been voices. It was too distant and distorted to make out words, but the melody was hypnotic and deeply unsettling. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the ground and the air itself. "We need to leave," Amanda said urgently. "Right now." "Leave?" Kevin laughed that glass-breaking laugh. "Oh, Amanda. Sweet, practical Amanda. Don't you understand? No one leaves Livermore. No one ever leaves." The singing grew louder, and shapes began to move in the darkness beyond our light. Tall, impossibly thin figures that moved like smoke between the trees. I caught glimpses of pale skin stretched over sharp bones, of faces that were almost human but wrong in fundamental ways. "Kevin," I said slowly, backing away from him. "What did you do? What did you find out there?" His smile widened until it seemed to split his face. "I found my family, Mike. My real family. The ones who've been waiting so patiently for new friends to join them." He lunged forward with inhuman speed, his transformed hands reaching for Sarah. She screamed and rolled aside, and Kevin's claws, they were definitely claws now, raked across the wooden shelter wall, leaving deep gouges. "Run!" I shouted. We grabbed what we could and bolted into the forest. Behind us, Kevin's laughter echoed through the trees, joined by other voices, other horrible sounds of pursuit. Our flashlights barely penetrated the darkness, and more than once I slammed into trees or tripped over roots I couldn't see. The sounds of pursuit grew closer. Whatever Kevin had become, he was fast. Faster than any human had a right to be. And he wasn't alone. I could hear multiple sets of footsteps crashing through the undergrowth behind us, along with that inhuman singing that seemed to drive spikes of pain through my skull. Amanda stumbled and fell, crying out in pain. Sarah and I hauled her to her feet, but she could barely walk. Her ankle was twisted, possibly broken. "Leave me," she gasped. "Get out of here." "Like hell," Sarah replied. We found a massive fallen tree and helped Amanda crawl underneath it, into a hollow space between the trunk and the ground. Sarah and I squeezed in beside her, trying to control our breathing as the sounds of pursuit grew closer. They found us anyway. Kevin's voice drifted through the forest, no longer quite human. "Mike, Sarah, Amanda, come out, come out. The family wants to meet you. They're so hungry, and you smell so alive." A pale hand reached under the log, fingers elongated and ending in black claws. I grabbed a rock and smashed it down on the reaching appendage. There was a shriek of pain and anger, but the hand withdrew. "Found you," Kevin's voice whispered, impossibly close to my ear despite the barrier of the fallen tree. More hands reached for us from different angles. The singing grew deafening, and I could see lights moving through the forest. Not flashlights, but a sickly phosphorescent glow that emanated from the creatures themselves. That's when I saw him. The real Kevin. He was suspended from a tree branch about 20 feet away, barely visible in the ghostly light. His body was emaciated, as if something had been feeding on him slowly. His eyes were open and aware, filled with pain and terror. He was trying to speak, but his mouth had been sewn shut with what looked like sinew. The thing that had been wearing his face turned to follow my gaze and laughed. "Oh, that old skin? I outgrew it. But don't worry, you'll get to keep yours a little longer. The transformation is so much sweeter when you're aware of every moment." I made a decision that probably saved our lives. Grabbing the camp stove fuel from Amanda's pack, I doused the area around us and ignited it. The flames roared to life and the creatures shrieked and fell back. They feared fire, or at least this fire seemed to cause them pain. "Move!" I shouted. We ran through the burning forest, leaving a trail of flames behind us. The creatures pursued, but couldn't get too close to the fire. I could hear them hissing and snarling just beyond the light. We ran for what felt like hours, though time had lost all meaning. The forest seemed to shift around us, paths appearing and disappearing, the terrain changing even as we moved through it. More than once I was certain we were running in circles, but stopping meant death. Finally, impossibly, we saw lights ahead. Real lights. The yellow glow of sodium vapor lamps in a parking lot. We stumbled out of the forest and onto pavement, gasping and shaking. We were back at the Oliverian Brook Trail parking area, though according to my broken watch, no time had passed at all. Our car sat exactly where we'd left it, but it was covered in a thin layer of frost despite the fact that it had been warm when we started our hike. Amanda collapsed beside the car, her injured ankle finally giving out completely. Sarah was catatonic, staring back at the forest with wide, traumatized eyes. I fumbled for my keys with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. That's when I saw the trail register. Our names were still there, signed in that bleeding black ink. But below our entry, in the same handwriting, was another signature. Kevin King and family. Party of 47. The ink was still wet. I drove us to the nearest hospital in Conway, where Amanda's ankle was treated, and we were all checked for injuries and shock. We told the police a simplified version, that Kevin had wandered off and gotten lost. Search and rescue teams combed the area for 3 days but found no trace of him. They did find something else, though. Deep in the forest, about 15 miles from where we claimed to have camped, they discovered the remains of the old Livermore settlement. According to the archaeologists, it had been abandoned since the 1890s when the entire population simply vanished one winter. The site showed signs of recent disturbance, and several trees bore fresh claw marks identical to what Kevin and I had seen. But that's not what haunts me most. 3 months later, Sarah killed herself. The note she left was brief. "They're calling me back. I can hear them singing, and Kevin's voice is so clear now. I have to go home to Livermore. I have to feed the family." Amanda moved across the country and refuses to discuss what happened. She changes her phone number every few months and never stays in one place for long. The last message I got from her was a single text. "They're still looking for us." As for me, I haven't been camping since. I live in the city now, surrounded by concrete and steel and electric lights that burn all night. But sometimes, in the early hours before dawn, I hear singing drifting through my apartment windows. Beautiful, terrible songs about hunger and family and the things that wait in the dark places of the world. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, my reflection smiles a little too wide. I know they're still out there, in the deep forests of New Hampshire. The Livermore family, waiting patiently for new members to join their ranks. Kevin is with them now, truly Kevin this time, transformed into something that hungers for the warmth and life of the living. They're patient, these creatures. They can wait decades for the right prey to wander into their territory, but they never forget a scent, never stop hunting once they've marked their quarry. I keep moving, keep the lights on, keep telling myself I escaped. But deep down, I know the truth. No one ever really leaves Livermore, and sooner or later I'll hear that singing clearly enough to follow it home. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote backcountry of the White Mountain National Forest, near the abandoned logging settlement of Livermore, New Hampshire. David Jones and I had been planning this trip for months. We'd grown up together in Boston, but our lives had taken different paths after college. Him into corporate finance, me into freelance photography. This weekend was supposed to be our chance to reconnect, to get back to the simple friendship we'd shared before mortgages and career pressures complicated everything. The plan was straightforward, a 3-day backpacking trip through some of the most isolated terrain in New Hampshire. We'd start at the Kankamagus Highway, hike north toward the old Livermore town site, then loop back through the Pemigewasset Wilderness. David had done extensive research finding old logging roads and abandoned trails that would take us far from the usual tourist routes. "Look at this," David had said, spreading topographical maps across my kitchen table the week before. His finger traced a thin line through dense green. "This old railroad grade connects to a mining trail from the 1800s. We'll see places no one's been to in decades." I should have paid more attention to the enthusiasm in his voice, the way his eyes lingered on those empty spaces between the contour lines. But I was caught up in my own excitement about photographing untouched wilderness. We set out on a Friday morning in late October, the maples already bare but the evergreens still holding their color against the gray sky. The weather forecast called for clear skies and temperatures in the 40s. Perfect hiking weather. We left David's car at a remote trailhead and began the 8-mile trek to our first campsite. For the first few hours, everything felt normal. We fell into the familiar rhythm of hiking partners. David setting a steady pace in front, me stopping occasionally to capture the interplay of light and shadow through the canopy. We talked about work, about women we were dating, about our plans for the future. The conversation flowed as easily as it had when we were teenagers exploring the woods behind our neighborhood. It was around 3 in the afternoon when we first noticed something was off. "My GPS is acting weird," David said, stopping to check his phone. We were following what appeared to be an old logging road, though it was so overgrown we could barely make out the path. I pulled out my own phone. The screen showed our location as a blank gray area with no terrain features, no roads, nothing. "Mine too, must be the tree cover." David frowned at his device, then at the paper map. "We should be here," he pointed to a spot on the topographical sheet, But according to this, we're about 2 miles southeast of where we actually are. Technology. I shrugged and shouldered my pack. That's why you brought the paper maps, right? But as we continued hiking, I noticed David checking his GPS more frequently, his frown deepening each time. The old logging road was becoming increasingly difficult to follow, branching into game trails that seemed to lead nowhere. Twice we had to backtrack when the path simply vanished into thick undergrowth. By 5 o'clock, we still hadn't reached our planned campsite. The October daylight was fading fast and the temperature was dropping more quickly than expected. We found a small clearing beside what might have once been a stream bed, now just a depression filled with rotting leaves and standing water. "This isn't right," David muttered as we set up our tents. "According to the map, there should be a clear stream here, and those rock formations." He gestured toward the tree line. "They're not on any of the surveys." I was more concerned with the practical matters of camp setup. "Does it matter? We've got water, we've got a flat spot to sleep. Tomorrow, we'll figure out where we are." But even as I said it, I felt the first stirring of unease. The clearing felt wrong somehow, too quiet. During our afternoon of hiking, I'd heard the usual forest sounds: squirrels chattering, birds calling, the whisper of wind through leaves. Now there was nothing. Even our voices seemed muffled, absorbed by the oppressive silence. David was having trouble with his camp stove. The gas burner kept sputtering and dying despite his repeated attempts to adjust the fuel flow. "This thing worked fine last weekend," he said, his frustration evident. "I tried my own stove with the same result. The flames would catch, burn normally for a few seconds, then gutter out as if the oxygen was being sucked away. We ended up eating cold food and building a fire for warmth, though even that proved difficult. The kindling would catch, but the flames stayed low and flickering, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of the fire itself." "You notice how quiet it is?" I asked as we sat around the struggling fire. David nodded, his face tense in the firelight. "No night sounds at all. No owls, no insects, nothing." As if in response to his words, a sound echoed from the darkness beyond our camp. A low, mournful call that seemed to come from all directions at once. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't animal either. The sound raised the hair on my arms and sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. David was already on his feet, grabbing a flashlight. "Probably just a loon. They can sound really strange when they're calling across water." But there was no water nearby, and we both knew loons didn't make sounds like that. The call came again, closer this time, with an almost questioning quality. It reminded me uncomfortably of a child calling for help, but distorted and wrong. We spent the rest of the evening in tense silence, feeding our anemic fire and checking our phones every few minutes. Neither device could find a signal, and both GPS units continued to show us in a gray void. At 10 o'clock, we decided to turn in, though I doubted either of us would sleep well. I was wrong about David. Within minutes of zipping up his tent, I could hear his breathing deepen into the rhythm of sleep. I lay awake for hours, listening to the oppressive silence and trying to identify the source of my growing anxiety. Every small sound, the settling of my sleeping bag, the whisper of wind through the trees, seemed amplified and somehow threatening. I must have finally drifted off around 2 in the morning because I was awakened by a sound that made my blood run cold. Someone was walking around our campsite, their footsteps crunching through the dead leaves with deliberate, measured steps. But the gait was wrong. Too long between steps, as if whoever was out there had legs that were slightly too long for their body. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps circled our camp once, then twice, always staying just at the edge of the dead fire's faint glow. I wanted to call out to David, but something primitive in my brain screamed at me to stay silent, to not let whatever was out there know I was awake. The footsteps stopped directly outside my tent. I could hear breathing, slow, deep, and wet, as if the lungs were filled with fluid. Then came a sound that nearly made me cry out. Someone unzipping the outer vestibule of David's tent. The zipper moved slowly, each tooth separating with agonizing clarity. I heard David mumble something in his sleep, then silence. The breathing continued for several minutes. Then the zipper closed again with the same deliberate slowness. The footsteps resumed, circling the camp one more time before fading into the forest. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag until dawn, afraid to move, afraid to investigate, afraid of what I might find. When morning finally came, I crawled out of my tent to find David already awake, sitting by the cold fire pit and staring into the forest with hollow eyes. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He looked at me blankly for a moment, then shook his head. "Slept like a rock. Why?" I told him about the footsteps, about the sound of his tent being opened. As I spoke, his expression became increasingly confused. "Mike, there's no way someone unzipped my tent without waking me up. And look." He gestured to his tent. "Everything's zipped up tight, just like I left it." I examined his tent more closely. He was right. The outer vestibule was completely closed, the zipper pull at the bottom just as it should be. But I knew what I'd heard. The memory was crystal clear, burned into my mind by adrenaline and terror. "Maybe it was a dream," David suggested gently. "You know how vivid they can be when you're stressed." I wanted to argue, but what was the alternative? That someone had crept into our isolated campsite in the middle of the night, opened his tent, done what? And then carefully zipped it back up without leaving any trace? We broke camp quickly and started hiking, both of us eager to leave the oppressive clearing behind. But our navigation problems only got worse. The trails we followed seemed to shift and change when we weren't looking directly at them. Paths that had been clear and well-defined would suddenly branch in impossible directions or simply disappear into impenetrable undergrowth. By noon, we were completely lost. "This doesn't make sense," David said, spreading the topographical map on a fallen log. "According to this, we should have hit the old railroad grade an hour ago. But there's nothing here. No sign there was ever a railroad anywhere near this area." I studied the map over his shoulder. The terrain features didn't match what we were seeing at all. Where the map showed gentle slopes and open forest, we found steep ravines and dense thickets. Where it indicated rocky outcroppings and clear streams, we found only marshy ground and rotting vegetation. "Maybe we got turned around yesterday," I suggested. "Made a wrong turn somewhere and ended up in a completely different area." But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't right. I'd been paying attention to our route, taking GPS readings despite the equipment failures. We couldn't have gotten that far off course without realizing it. David's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. He would stop suddenly and listen to sounds I couldn't hear, then hurry forward as if driven by some internal urgency. His eyes had taken on a strange quality, too bright and too focused, as if he was seeing things the rest of the world couldn't perceive. "Do you smell that?" he asked around 2 o'clock, stopping abruptly on what seemed to be another abandoned logging road. I sniffed the air. Forest smells, decomposing leaves, pine sap, the earthy scent of moss and fungi. "Smell what?" "Cooking meat. Someone's got a fire going nearby." His nostrils flared as he tested the air. Fresh meat. Really fresh. I couldn't smell anything like that. But David was already heading off the path, following some scent trail only he could detect. I had no choice but to follow, crashing through the undergrowth as he moved with increasing urgency through the trees. We emerged into another clearing, this one larger than our previous campsite and dominated by the ruins of an old stone foundation. David stopped at the edge of the clearing, his whole body rigid with anticipation. "There," he whispered, pointing toward the ruins. "Can you see them?" I looked where he was pointing but saw only empty stone walls and piles of rotting timber. "See what?" "The people. There's a whole family gathered around the fire. They're cooking something large." His voice had taken on a dreamy quality as if he was speaking from inside a trance. I grabbed his arm, feeling the muscle tension beneath his jacket. "David, there's nobody there. It's just old ruins." He turned to look at me, and for a moment I didn't recognize the expression in his eyes. They were hungry, predatory, like a wolf that had caught the scent of prey. Then he blinked, and the look was gone, replaced by confusion. What was I saying? You thought you saw people. A family cooking. He looked back at the ruins, then at me, genuine bewilderment on his face. "I don't see anything. Why are we here?" The incident left me deeply unsettled, but David seemed to recover quickly, too quickly. As we set up camp in the ruins, the most sheltered spot we'd found all day, he was almost manic in his enthusiasm, chattering about the history of the area and the possibilities for exploration tomorrow. "Just think about all the stories these stones could tell," he said as we arranged our sleeping bags on the flattest section of the old foundation. Families lived here, worked here, raised children. Then something made them leave. What do you think it was? I didn't want to think about it. The ruins felt wrong, oppressive in the same way our previous campsite had felt wrong. But we needed shelter, and darkness was falling fast. This time, our fire caught easily and burned bright, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls around us. David seemed fascinated by the shadows, watching them with the same intense focus he'd shown when tracking his imaginary scent trail. "They're dancing," he murmured. "Can you see them dancing?" I looked at the shadows, just the normal flickering patterns that any fire casts on irregular surfaces. "They're just shadows, David." But even as I said it, I began to see what he meant. The shadows did seem to move with purpose, swaying and leaping in patterns that had nothing to do with the flames that cast them. And in their movement, I could almost make out shapes, human figures holding hands, spinning in circles around some central point I couldn't quite identify. I forced myself to look away, to focus on practical matters: food, water, the weather forecast for tomorrow. But when I glanced back at the shadows, they were still dancing, and now they seemed to be beckoning. David was completely entranced. He sat motionless, staring at the wall with an expression of wonder and hunger that made my skin crawl. When I spoke to him, he didn't respond. When I touched his shoulder, he didn't react. "David!" I shook him harder, and finally he turned to look at me. "What?" His voice was distant, dreamy. "You were staring at the wall. For like 10 minutes. He blinked several times, then looked around the campsite as if seeing it for the first time. Was I? I don't remember. I was thinking about something, but I can't remember what. We went to bed early, both of us exhausted by the day's confusion and disorientation. But sleep brought no relief. I spent the night in a series of vivid, disturbing dreams. Visions of figures dancing around fires, of meat roasting on spits, of faces that looked human but weren't quite right. I woke to the sound of David's tent zipper opening. Through the thin nylon of my own tent, I could see his silhouette moving around the campsite. The fire had died to embers, and his movements were barely visible in the faint glow. "David?" I called softly. "Everything okay?" No response. I could hear him moving around, but his footsteps had that same wrong quality I'd noticed 2 nights before. Too measured, too deliberate, as if he was learning how to walk. I unzipped my tent and peered out. David was standing at the edge of the clearing, completely motionless, facing the dark forest. He was naked from the waist up, his pale skin almost luminous in the dim light. "David, what are you doing?" He turned toward me, and in the faint firelight I could see his face. It was David's face, but somehow wrong. The proportions were slightly off, as if someone had tried to reshape familiar features from memory and gotten the details almost, but not quite right. "I'm listening," he said, and his voice had the same wrong quality as his footsteps. "Listening to what?" "They're calling. Can't you hear them? They're so hungry, Michael. So very hungry." Before I could respond, he turned and walked into the forest, moving with that same deliberate, measured gait. I called after him, but he didn't stop or look back. Within seconds, he had disappeared completely into the darkness. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my tent, afraid to follow him into the forest, afraid to stay alone in the ruins. When dawn finally came, I crawled out to find David's tent empty, his sleeping bag unzipped from the inside just as mine had been 2 nights before. But his backpack was still there, along with all his gear. His boots sat neatly beside his tent, laces tied in perfect bows. Whatever had walked into the forest wearing David's body hadn't needed any of David's belongings. I should have hiked out immediately, found help, reported him missing. But something kept me there in the ruins, waiting. Some primitive instinct told me that David, or whatever David had become, would return. I was right. He came back just after sunset, walking out of the forest with that same measured gait. He was fully dressed now, carrying an armload of firewood, smiling the kind of smile you see on corporate headshots, perfectly pleasant and completely empty. "Sorry about last night," he said, dumping the wood beside our fire pit. I couldn't sleep, so I went for a walk. Got a bit turned around in the dark. I stared at him, trying to identify what was wrong beyond the obvious wrongness of everything. His clothes were clean and neat, despite a day spent wandering through dense forest. His hiking boots showed no signs of mud or wear. Most disturbing of all, he smelled wrong. Not dirty or sweaty as he should have after a day in the wilderness, but like something that had been cleaned and prepared. "Where did you go?" I asked. "Just exploring. This is fascinating country, Mike. There's so much history here, so many stories buried in these woods." His smile never wavered, never touched his eyes. I found some amazing ruins deeper in the forest. Foundations, old roads, even what looks like a cemetery. We should explore it together tomorrow. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this thing that looked like David as quickly as possible. But I also needed to know what had happened to my friend, needed to understand what I was dealing with. "Sure," I said. "Sounds interesting." We made dinner together. Or rather, I made dinner while David sat by the fire and watched me with that constant, empty smile. He ate mechanically without apparent enjoyment, as if he was performing a function he'd observed but didn't truly understand. "Tell me about these ruins you found," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Oh, they're wonderful. Really wonderful. There are foundations for at least a dozen buildings, and some of them are much older than this place. Much older." His eyes gleamed with an enthusiasm that didn't match his flat tone. "And the cemetery. Michael, some of those graves have been opened. Opened from the inside." I nearly choked on my food. "What do you mean, opened from the inside?" "Exactly what I said. The coffins are broken outward, as if whatever was buried there decided to leave. Isn't that fascinating?" I forced myself to take another bite, to maintain the pretense of normal conversation. "That sounds really interesting. We should definitely check it out." "Yes." His smile widened, becoming almost predatory. "I think you'll find it very educational." That night I didn't even pretend to sleep. I lay in my tent with my knife in my hand, listening to the sounds from David's tent. Not sleeping sounds. Shuffling, rustling noises, as if he was constantly rearranging himself, trying to find a comfortable position in a body that didn't quite fit. Around 3 a.m, the sounds stopped. I heard his tent zipper open, then footsteps moving around the campsite. But this time, the footsteps were normal. David's familiar gait, the rhythm I'd heard on 100 hiking trips. "Mike?" His voice was different too, strained and frightened. "Mike, are you awake? Something's wrong. Something's really wrong." I unzipped my tent and looked out. David was standing by the dead fire, but this was the real David. I could tell immediately. His posture, his expression, the way he held his shoulders, everything was right again. "What's wrong?" I asked, though I thought I knew. "I don't remember yesterday. Any of it. I remember going to sleep the night before and then nothing until just now. And Mike, I'm not wearing the same clothes. These aren't my clothes." I looked more closely. He was right. The jacket was similar to his, but not identical. The boots were the wrong brand. Even his watch was different, older and more worn than the one I remembered. "Where do you think you've been?" "I don't know, but I have these images. Fragments of memory that don't make sense. I remember walking through the forest, but I was following someone. Someone who looked exactly like you." My blood went cold. "What do you mean, like me?" "Same height, same build, same face. But it wasn't you, Mike. I could tell it wasn't you because it moved wrong, talked wrong, and it kept trying to get me to go places, to see things." He shuddered. "Terrible things." I was about to respond when I heard it. Footsteps in the forest, moving toward our camp with that measured, deliberate gait. David heard them too, and his face went white. "It's coming back," he whispered. "Whatever it is, it's coming back for me." The footsteps stopped just beyond the ring of light from our dead fire. I could see a shape in the darkness. Tall, humanoid, but wrong in ways my mind couldn't quite process. When it spoke, it used my voice. "David, why did you leave? I was showing you such interesting things." David grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh. "Don't listen to it. Don't let it talk to you. That's how it gets in. Through your ears, through your mind." But I was already listening, already feeling the pull of that familiar voice speaking impossible words. The thing that looked like me stepped into the light, and I saw my own face smiling back at me with that same empty, corporate expression David had worn. "Michael," it said in my voice, "don't you want to see the cemetery? Don't you want to learn what happened to all the families who lived here? They're still here, you know. All of them. Waiting in the ground, waiting for visitors." "Run," David whispered urgently. "Run now, while you still can." But I couldn't move. The thing wearing my face was walking closer, and with each step I felt my will to resist growing weaker. It was beautiful, in a terrible way, the perfect predator, wearing the face of trust itself. "The families didn't leave," it continued in my voice. "They were invited to stay, to become part of something larger, something that has been hungry for so very long. And now they're inviting you." David suddenly lunged forward, tackling the doppelganger around the waist. They went down in a tangle of limbs, rolling toward the stone ruins. I heard David screaming. Not words, but pure animal terror and rage. The sound broke whatever spell had been holding me. I grabbed my pack and ran. I crashed through the forest blindly, branches tearing at my clothes and skin, not caring about direction or destination. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of struggle, David's screams growing weaker and more distant. Then, silence. I ran for hours, until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. When I finally collapsed, I found myself on a familiar trail. The Kankamagas Highway was less than a mile ahead. Somehow, in my panic, I had found my way back to civilization. The rescue teams found David's body 3 days later, or what was left of it. The official report blamed bears, noting the severe trauma and the fact that much of the soft tissue was missing. They never found our campsite, never found the ruins or the cemetery David had described. But I know what really happened in those woods. Something old and hungry had been feeding in the White Mountains for generations, sustaining itself on the families and travelers who ventured too far from the marked trails. It had learned to wear familiar faces, to speak in trusted voices, to lure its prey deeper into the wilderness where no one would ever find them. The thing I saw, wearing my face, wasn't David's killer. It was David, or what he had become after accepting the invitation to stay. And somewhere in those endless woods, there's a cemetery full of graves opened from the inside, full of families who decided to become part of something larger and hungrier than themselves. I never returned to New Hampshire. I never went hiking again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps outside my apartment. Measured, deliberate steps that circle the building once, twice, 3 times before fading into the urban darkness. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see something else looking back, something that smiles too long and blinks too little, something that remembers the taste of invitation and the sweetness of surrender. The hunger is patient. The hunger is learning. And someday soon, the hunger will come calling again, wearing a face I trust completely, speaking in a voice I've known all my life. When it does, I won't run. I can't run forever. After all, the families in the cemetery are so very lonely, and they've been waiting such a long time for visitors. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the White Mountain National Forest near Mount Washington in New Hampshire during what was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip with my closest friends. It was late September, and the leaves were just beginning to turn. Sarah Rodriguez, my college roommate, had been planning this trip for months. She'd found what she called the perfect spot, a remote camping area near the Dry River Trail, about 8 miles from the nearest ranger station. No cell towers, no other campers, just us and nature, she'd said with that infectious grin of hers, the kind that made you forget about the pile of work waiting on your desk and the bills stacking up at home. Our group consisted of 5 people. Myself, Sarah, my boyfriend Michael Williams, we'd laughed about sharing a last name since our second date, his best friend Kevin King, and Lisa Gonzalez, Sarah's co-worker from the hospital where they both worked as nurses. We'd all known each other for years, except Lisa, who was relatively new but had quickly become part of our tight-knit circle. I remember the drive up Route 302 that Friday afternoon. The trees formed a canopy overhead, filtering the October sunlight into dancing patterns across the windshield. Michael was driving, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel to some classic rock station. Kevin sat shotgun, already 3 beers into what he called vacation mode, despite it being barely noon. Sarah and Lisa chatted in the back seat about work gossip and weekend plans, their laughter mixing with the music. Everything felt normal. Everything felt safe. We reached the trailhead around 2 p.m. The parking area was empty except for one rusted pickup truck that looked like it had been abandoned for months. Weeds grew through its wheel wells and the windshield was spiderwebbed with cracks. Sarah frowned at it but shrugged. "Probably some local who knows a shortcut out," she said. The hike to our campsite took nearly 3 hours. Sarah led the way with her GPS device and printed trail maps, though the path was well marked at first. The Dry River Trail wound through dense forest, crossing wooden bridges over babbling streams and climbing gradually toward the higher elevations. The air smelled of pine needles and decomposing leaves, that rich, earthy scent that city dwellers like us rarely experienced. But as we climbed higher, the trail markers became less frequent. The path itself seemed to fork and split in ways that didn't match Sarah's map. She'd stop every few hundred yards, frowning at her GPS, which kept losing satellite signal despite the clear sky above us. "These trees are thicker than I expected," she muttered, holding the device up toward various gaps in the canopy. "Must be interfering with the signal." Kevin, who'd been complaining about his pack weight for the last hour, dropped it with a thud. "Maybe we should head back, find somewhere closer to the main trail." "Don't be such a baby," Lisa laughed, though I noticed she kept looking over her shoulder. "We've come this far." Michael squeezed my hand. "You doing okay, Jen?" I nodded, though something felt off. The forest was too quiet. In all my previous hiking experiences, there had always been sounds. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, insects buzzing. Here, even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the trees were absorbing every sound we made. We found our campsite just as the sun began to set. It was a small clearing beside a creek, exactly as Sarah had described from her research. The water ran clear and cold, perfect for refilling our bottles and washing up. Someone had built a fire ring from river stones, though it looked old and unused. "See?" Sarah said, spreading her arms wide. "Perfect." We set up camp quickly, working in the familiar rhythm we'd developed over years of hiking together. Michael and Kevin pitched the 3 tents while Sarah and I gathered firewood. Lisa started preparing dinner on her portable camp stove. Everything was normal, efficient, comfortable. But as darkness fell, that feeling of wrongness returned, stronger now. The fire wouldn't catch properly. I'd built hundreds of campfires over the years, and I knew what I was doing, but the flames kept guttering out despite the dry wood and lack of wind. When they did catch, they burned strange colors, deep blues and greens mixed with the normal orange. Weird minerals in the wood, maybe, Michael suggested, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty. Kevin opened another beer and stared into the flames. My grandfather used to say that colored fires meant spirits were near, he said, then laughed nervously. Old Irish superstition. Great, I muttered, just what we need. Dinner was chili from Sarah's camp stove, served with crackers and cheese. It should have been delicious after the long hike, but everything tasted slightly off, as if the metal of the cans had leached into the food. Lisa barely ate anything, claiming her stomach was upset from the altitude change. As the night deepened, the silence became oppressive. No owls hooting, no insects chirping, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the crackling of our fire and the distant murmur of the creek. It's so quiet, Sarah said, voicing what we were all thinking. Maybe the bears are nearby, Kevin suggested. Animals go quiet when predators are around. This didn't help anyone's mood. We tried to maintain our usual camping traditions, ghost stories, silly games, too much alcohol, but everything felt forced. Our laughter sounded hollow in the stillness. The darkness beyond our fire seemed to press in on us, thick and alive. Around midnight, Lisa announced she was turning in. I feel like I'm being watched, she said, zipping herself into her tent. Sarah followed shortly after, leaving just Michael, Kevin, and me around the dying fire. Should we keep someone awake? Kevin asked. Take shifts. Shifts for what? Michael replied, but he was scanning the tree line as he spoke. I banked the fire carefully, leaving enough coals to restart it in the morning, and we retreated to our respective tents. Michael and I shared a 2-person backpacking tent, cramped but warm. He fell asleep quickly, but I lay awake listening to the silence, my body tense despite my exhaustion. That's when I heard the footsteps. Soft, deliberate, circling our camp. Not the heavy tread of a bear or the quick patter of smaller animals. These were careful, measured, almost human, but not quite right. The rhythm was off. Too long between steps, as if whatever was walking was taking its time, studying us. I nudged Michael awake. Do you hear that? He listened for a long moment. The footsteps had stopped. Hear what? Never mind, I whispered, but I stayed awake until dawn, straining my ears for any sound that would explain what I'd heard. The next morning brought no relief. Kevin was the first to notice something wrong. Where's my pack? He asked, standing in the spot where he'd left his backpack the night before. We searched the entire campsite, but it was simply gone. Not dragged away, not torn open by animals. Just vanished. Maybe you moved it and forgot, Sarah suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. Kevin's pack had contained most of our backup food and his sleeping bag. Without it, we were looking at shorter rations and an uncomfortable night ahead. We should head back, I said. Something's not right here. But when Sarah checked her GPS and maps, she frowned in confusion. According to the device, we weren't where we were supposed to be. The trail we'd taken yesterday didn't exist on any of her maps. That's impossible, she muttered, turning the GPS off and on again. We followed the marked trail. Michael took a look at the maps. Maybe we took a wrong turn somewhere. The trails all look similar. I know what I'm doing, Sarah snapped more sharply than usual. I've been planning this trip for months. But as we broke camp and tried to retrace our steps, it became clear that we were lost. The trail we'd followed yesterday was nowhere to be found. In its place were 3 different paths, none of which appeared on Sarah's maps or in her GPS database. This is wrong, Lisa said quietly. She'd been pale and silent all morning, picking at her breakfast and jumping at every small sound. "The whole forest is wrong." "What do you mean?" Kevin asked. "Look around," she said, gesturing at the trees. "Really look." I followed her gaze and felt my skin crawl. She was right. The trees were different from yesterday. The spacing was wrong, the types of trees were wrong, even the way the light filtered through the canopy was wrong. It was as if we'd been transported to an entirely different forest overnight. "That's impossible," Michael said, but his voice wavered. Sarah was frantically checking her GPS, turning in circles as if the device would suddenly make sense. "We're here," she said, pointing to a spot on her electronic map. "We have to be here. But according to this, there should be a ranger station half a mile west." We decided to head west, following Sarah's GPS toward where the ranger station should be. But after an hour of hiking through increasingly dense forest, we found ourselves back at our campsite. "How is that possible?" Kevin demanded. "We walked in a straight line." "No, we didn't," Lisa said quietly. "We've been walking in a circle, the whole time." That's when we noticed the smell. It was subtle at first, mixing with the normal forest scents of pine and decay, but as the day wore on, it became stronger. A sickly, sweet odor like rotting meat mixed with something chemical, almost medicinal. "Dead animal," Michael suggested, but none of us believed it. The smell was too pervasive, too complex. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, hanging in the air like an invisible fog. By midday, Kevin was showing signs of serious distress. He'd been muttering to himself for the past hour, occasionally stopping to stare into the trees as if he saw something the rest of us couldn't. "There's someone watching us," he said suddenly, grabbing my arm. "In the trees. Can't you see them?" I looked where he was pointing but saw only shadows and branches. "Kevin, there's no one there," Sarah said gently. "Yes, there is," he insisted. "They've been following us all morning, staying just out of sight, but they're there." Lisa moved closer to me. "He's scaring me," she whispered. We stopped for lunch in another small clearing, though none of us had much appetite. The smell was stronger here, and Kevin's behavior was getting worse. He kept turning toward the trees, having conversations with people who weren't there. "We need to get out of here," I told Michael quietly. "Something's seriously wrong." "I know," he replied. "But which way? Sarah's GPS is useless and every trail leads back here." That's when we heard the voice. It came from deeper in the forest, carried on a wind that didn't exist. A voice calling Kevin's name, clear as day but wrong somehow. Too deep, too hollow, like an echo in reverse. Kevin's head snapped up. "That's my sister," he said, starting toward the sound. "That's Emma. She's here." Michael grabbed his arm. "Kevin, your sister lives in Boston. She's not here." "She's here," Kevin insisted, pulling free. "I have to go to her." The voice called again, and this time we all heard it clearly. It did sound like a woman calling Kevin's name, but there was something underneath it. Something that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. Kevin broke free and ran toward the trees. "Kevin, stop!" Sarah screamed, but he was already disappearing into the forest. We chased after him, crashing through underbrush and low branches, calling his name. But the forest seemed to swallow sound as soon as we made it. Our shouts fell dead in the air, and Kevin's thrashing footsteps faded to nothing within seconds. We searched for 3 hours, calling his name until our voices gave out. But Kevin was gone, vanished as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him. As evening approached, we made camp in the same clearing where we'd started. There was nowhere else to go, no trail to follow, no landmarks to guide us. The GPS showed us in the middle of blank wilderness, miles from any marked trail or road. "This isn't possible," Sarah kept repeating. "Forests don't work this way. You can't get this lost in New Hampshire." But we were lost, more lost than should have been possible in a state where you can't walk more than a few miles in any direction without hitting a road or a town. The fire was even harder to light this time, When the flames finally caught, they burned almost entirely blue and green, casting weird shadows that moved independently of the trees. The smell of rot was so strong now that we could taste it, coating our mouths and throats like oil. Lisa hadn't spoken in hours. She sat staring into the fire, her eyes reflecting the colored flames. When I touched her shoulder, she didn't respond. "Lisa," I said softly, "are you okay?" She turned to look at me, and I nearly screamed. Her eyes were wrong. Not the color, not the shape, but something fundamental about them. They were too deep, too empty, like looking into abandoned wells. "I'm fine," she said in a voice that wasn't quite hers, "just tired." Michael noticed it too. "Lisa, when did you last eat something?" "I'm not hungry," she replied, still in that hollow voice. "I don't think I need food anymore." Sarah was too absorbed in her maps and GPS to notice the change in Lisa, but the device in her hands was behaving strangely. The screen kept flickering, showing impossible readings, negative elevations, coordinates that placed us in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, timestamps from years in the future. "We'll stay together tonight," Michael announced. "No one goes anywhere alone." But when I woke up sometime after midnight, Lisa was gone. Her sleeping bag was still zipped up, still shaped as if someone was inside it, but when I reached over to shake her awake, there was nothing there. The bag was empty, zipped from the inside, still warm. "Michael," I whispered urgently, "Lisa's gone." We searched with flashlights, staying close together, calling her name in hushed voices. The colored fire had died down to strange coals that pulsed like a heartbeat. Our flashlight beams seemed weak and thin, swallowed by the darkness after only a few feet. That's when we heard Kevin's voice. He was calling to us from somewhere in the trees. His voice carried on that impossible wind. But the words weren't right. They were too long, stretched out like a recording played too slow. And underneath his voice was something else, a wet, tearing sound like meat being pulled apart. "Kevin," Sarah called back. "Where are you?" "Come find me," his voice replied, but the words overlapped each other as if multiple Kevins were speaking at once. "Come into the trees. It's beautiful here." Michael grabbed my arm. "That's not Kevin," he whispered. The voice came again, closer now. "Sarah, Jennifer, Michael, come see what I found. Come see what's waiting for you." Lisa's voice joined Kevin's, both of them calling to us from the darkness. But, like Kevin's, her voice was wrong. Too deep, too wet, like she was speaking through a mouthful of blood. "We need to run," I said. "Where?" Sarah demanded. "Run where? Every direction leads back here." But we couldn't stay. The voices were getting closer, and underneath them was a new sound. Something large moving through the forest, breaking branches, but moving wrong. The rhythm was off, like it had too many legs or was dragging something heavy. We stuffed our gear into our packs by flashlight and left the clearing, choosing the path that led downhill, hoping it would take us away from whatever was hunting us. But even as we ran, I knew it was futile. The forest would bring us back. It always brought us back. The voices followed us, calling our names, pleading with us to stop and wait. Kevin's voice promised to show us the way out. Lisa's voice sang lullabies from our childhood, songs she couldn't possibly know, and underneath it all was something else, a sound like winter wind, like starving wolves, like the last breath of dying things. It spoke without words, and somehow I understood what it was saying. It was hungry. It had been hungry for so long. We ran until we collapsed, gasping and shaking, in another small clearing. But it was the same clearing, the same fire ring, the same stream, the same watching trees. No matter which direction we took, no matter how far we ran, we always ended up back where we started. Dawn brought no relief. The voices had stopped, but the smell of decay was overwhelming now, and our remaining food had spoiled overnight. Not just gone bad, it was black and crawling with maggots that shouldn't have been able to survive in the cold mountain air. Sarah's GPS was now showing readings that hurt to look at, coordinates with too many digits, elevations that claimed we were simultaneously a mile underground and floating in space. The date on the device changed constantly, showing times that ranged from the distant past to the far future. "Time isn't working right here," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "Nothing's working right." That's when Kevin returned. He walked out of the trees around midday, moving with that same careful, measured step I'd heard that first night. But it wasn't Kevin. Not really. The thing that looked like Kevin smiled too wide, its teeth too sharp, its eyes too deep. It moved wrong, as if it wasn't used to walking upright, as if it was remembering how to be human. "I found the way out," it said in Kevin's voice. "Follow me." "Kevin." Sarah started toward it, but Michael caught her arm. "That's not Kevin," he said firmly. The Kevin thing tilted its head at an angle that would have broken a human neck. "Of course I'm Kevin. Don't you recognize me?" And that's when I saw what was wrong with it. Kevin had a scar on his left hand from a childhood accident, a small white line across his knuckles. The thing wearing his face had the scar, but it was on the wrong hand. "You're not Kevin," I said. It smiled wider, and I could see that its teeth went too far back, row after row like a shark's. "Smart girl. But hungry is hungry, and meat is meat." That's when Lisa emerged from the trees behind it. She moved the same way, that careful, predatory gait, and she had the same too wide smile and too deep eyes. But she was wrong in different ways. Her proportions were slightly off, as if something had tried to rebuild her from memory and gotten the details wrong. "We've been waiting for you," she said in a voice like grinding bones. More figures emerged from the forest, people wearing familiar faces but wrong in fundamental ways. I recognized some of them: hikers from other trips, people from photos and missing person reports. All of them smiling those terrible smiles, all of them moving with that same unnatural gait. And behind them, finally revealing itself, was the thing that had been hunting us. It was ancient and starving and wrong, tall as the trees but too thin, with limbs that bent in impossible directions and fingers that ended in yellowed claws. Its face was a shifting collection of all the faces it had stolen, all the people it had consumed. But underneath them all was something else, something that had never been human, that came from the cold and hungry places between worlds. A Wendigo, the creature from Kevin's grandfather's stories, but worse than any legend could describe. "3 days you've been here," it said in a voice like breaking glass. 3 years, 3 decades. Time moves differently when you're being digested, and I understood then what had happened. We weren't lost in the forest. We were lost in its stomach, in some pocket dimension where it kept its prey while it slowly consumed them. The changing landscape, the impossible paths, the failure of technology. We were inside a predator that existed partially outside normal reality. "Run," Michael whispered, but there was nowhere to run. Every direction led back to the same clearing, the same trap. The Wendigo laughed and the sound shattered something inside my chest. "Run if you want. Struggle if you want. It only makes the meat more tender." The fake Kevin and Lisa started walking toward us, their movements becoming less human with each step. Behind them, the other stolen faces began to emerge from the trees. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all wearing the faces of people who had vanished in these mountains over the years. Michael grabbed a burning branch from our strange fire and swung it at the nearest one. The colored flames left a trail of blue and green in the air, and where they touched the creature, it screamed and stumbled back. "The fire!" he shouted. "The fire hurts them!" Sarah grabbed another branch, and so did I. The colored flames felt cold in my hands, and they whispered things I tried not to hear. But they were weapons, and we were desperate. We fought our way through the crowd of stolen faces, swinging our makeshift torches, trying to reach the trees on the far side of the clearing. Some of the creatures fell back, but others pressed forward despite the flames. their stolen skin charring and peeling away to reveal something pale and writhing underneath. The Wendigo watched us with amusement, making no move to stop us. It knew what we hadn't realized yet. There was no escape. Every path led back to its hunting ground. But as we reached the tree line, something unexpected happened. My torch went out, and in the sudden darkness I heard a new sound. Engines. Helicopters. "Search and rescue," Sarah gasped. "Impossible," the Wendigo snarled, its composure breaking for the first time. "No one finds what I have taken." But the sound was getting closer, and with it came electric lights cutting through the supernatural darkness. The stolen faces began to waver and fade, losing cohesion as something from the real world intruded on the Wendigo's domain. "Jennifer Williams." The voice came from above, amplified by a loudspeaker. "Michael Williams, if you can hear this, signal with light." Sarah still had her torch. She held it high, waving it frantically, and the colored flame suddenly burned normal orange and red. The Wendigo let out a sound like the death of winter, a scream that shattered trees and sent the remaining stolen faces scattering into the darkness. But it was weakening. The intrusion of the rescue team was disrupting whatever force allowed it to exist partially outside reality. "This isn't over," it hissed as its form began to waver. "I know your taste now. I know your smell. Someday you'll be alone, and I'll find you." The helicopter spotlight found us, and everything changed. The impossible forest vanished like smoke, revealing the actual White Mountain National Forest around us. We were only a mile from the main trail, in a completely normal patch of woods that showed up on every map. The rescue team found us hypothermic and delirious, babbling about missing friends and monsters in the trees. They searched for Kevin and Lisa for 3 days but found no trace. According to the official report, they had probably fallen into one of the many ravines in the area and been carried away by the recent rains. But I know better. I know they're still there, in that pocket of twisted reality where the Wendigo keeps its prey. Still being slowly consumed, still wearing faces that aren't quite right. The doctors said we suffered from exposure and altitude sickness, that our shared hallucinations were the result of dehydration and hypothermia. They had explanations for everything. The GPS malfunctions, the disorientation, the missing time, but they couldn't explain why my hair turned white during those 3 days. They couldn't explain why Sarah wakes up screaming every night, or why Michael can't stand the smell of pine trees anymore. And they couldn't explain the photographs on my phone. I didn't take any pictures during our trip. I was too focused on survival. But when I checked my phone after we got back, there were dozens of photos I don't remember taking. Images of Kevin and Lisa, but wrong. Progressively wrong. In the first few photos, they look normal. But as you scroll through them, small details change. Their proportions shift slightly. Their smiles become too wide. Their eyes become too deep. The last photo shows them standing at the edge of our campsite, smiling those terrible smiles, with the Wendigo's shadow falling across them like wings. I've tried to delete the photos, but they always come back. And sometimes late at night I get text messages from Kevin's and Lisa's phone numbers. Just coordinates. GPS locations in the White Mountains. The same coordinates, over and over. I think it's still hungry. I think it's still waiting. And I know that someday, despite everything I tell myself, I'll be tempted to go back. The mountains call to you after an experience like that. They whisper promises of closure, of answers, of finding your lost friends. But I won't go. I can't go. Because in the last photo on my phone, the one that appears no matter how many times I delete it, the Wendigo is looking directly at the camera. And it's wearing my face. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 24 years old. This happened in the White Mountain National Forest, about 15 miles northeast of Mount Washington in New Hampshire, during the 3rd week of October 2023. The morning air cut through my lungs like shattered glass as I shouldered my pack outside the ranger station at Pinkham Notch. David Jones, my best friend since freshman year at UNH, was already loading gear into his battered Subaru. his breath forming small clouds that hung in the crisp air before dissolving. Jennifer Williams, no relation despite sharing my last name, emerged from the station building with our hiking permits, her auburn hair catching the pale sunlight filtering through the canopy of sugar maples overhead. "Trail conditions are deteriorating rapidly," she announced, waving the permits. "Ranger said there's already 6 inches of snow above 4,000 feet, and more coming tonight." Sarah Rodriguez looked up from where she was checking her camera equipment. She was documenting our trip for her photography thesis. "We can handle a little snow. We've been planning this for months." David slammed the tailgate shut with more force than necessary. "Besides, we're only going up to the Zealand Falls hut, not summiting anything crazy. It's what, 8 miles? We'll be fine." I should have listened to the unease that crawled up my spine like cold fingers. Should have paid attention to how Jennifer's usually steady hands trembled slightly as she folded the permits. Should have noticed how David's eyes seemed darker than usual, hungrier somehow, as if the approaching wilderness was already calling to something buried deep within him. But I was 24 and invincible, and my best friend since childhood had been talking about this backcountry trip since spring semester ended. The 4 of us had spent countless hours poring over topographic maps, planning our route through the remote Zealand Valley, far from the crowded trails that drew weekend warriors and leaf peepers. We wanted solitude, wanted to experience the mountains as they truly were, wild, unforgiving, and utterly indifferent to human ambition. The Zealand Road ended abruptly at a small parking area surrounded by towering white pines and paper birches whose leaves had already surrendered to autumn's brutal honesty. Only 2 other vehicles sat in the lot, a rusted pickup truck with New Hampshire plates and a newer Honda with Massachusetts tags. The sight of other cars should have been comforting, but something about the way they sat empty and slightly skewed in their parking spaces made my stomach clench. "Looks like we're not the only ones brave enough to push the season," Sarah observed, snapping a photo of the Honda. Its windshield was spiderwebbed with frost, and someone had written, "Help," in the condensation on the driver's side window before it had frozen solid. David was already striding toward the trailhead, his pace aggressive and impatient. Probably just some college kids being dramatic. Come on, we're burning daylight. The Zealand Trail began innocuously enough, winding through mixed hardwood forests that blazed with reds and golds so vivid they seemed to pulse with their own light. But as we climbed steadily upward, following the meandering path of the Zealand River, the deciduous trees gave way to darker conifers that seemed to absorb sound rather than echo it. Our footsteps, which had rung crisp and clear on the lower trail, became muffled and strangely distant. Jennifer, who was studying wildlife biology and never missed an opportunity to share her knowledge, pointed out the absence of birdsong after we'd been hiking for an hour. This time of year, we should be hearing chickadees, nuthatches, maybe even some late migrants. It's too quiet. "Maybe they know something we don't," Sarah muttered, adjusting her camera strap. She'd been taking fewer photos as we climbed, and I noticed her glancing frequently over her shoulder as if expecting to find something following us. David stopped abruptly at a bend in the trail where a massive granite boulder split the path. He consulted his GPS unit, frowning at the display. "This is weird. According to this, we should be at the river crossing, but..." He gestured ahead where the trail clearly continued climbing through unbroken forest. I pulled out my own GPS and felt my first real stab of concern. The display showed our location as a blue dot floating in empty green space, with no trail markers or topographic features visible. Mine's not working either. Must be the tree cover interfering with the satellites. But even as I said it, I looked up through the canopy and saw clear sky. No reason for GPS failure. No reason at all. "Good thing I brought a compass and paper map," Jennifer said, pulling out her topographic chart. She spread it against the boulder and we gathered around. But what we saw made no sense. According to the map, we should have crossed the Zealand River twice by now, but we hadn't seen any water since leaving the parking area. The trail we'd been following for 2 hours simply didn't exist on paper. "We must have taken a wrong turn somewhere," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. We'd been on a well-marked trail the entire time. following white blazes painted on trees every 50 yards or so. There had been no side trails, no opportunities to deviate from the path. David folded the map with sharp, angry movements. Maps are wrong all the time. We keep going until we hit something recognizable. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in the span of 20 minutes. I know because I checked my watch and thermometer obsessively as ice crystals began forming on our breath and the first snow began to fall. Not the gentle, picturesque snow of calendar photographs, but hard pellets that stung exposed skin and accumulated with frightening speed on the increasingly narrow trail. We should have turned back then, should have retraced our steps to the parking area while we still could. But David pushed forward with an intensity that bordered on compulsion, and the rest of us followed because none of us wanted to be the one to suggest defeat. Pride and peer pressure, the twin killers of common sense. By the time we admitted we were lost, the trail had disappeared entirely beneath 6 inches of fresh powder, and the trees around us bore no resemblance to any marked on Jennifer's map. These weren't the familiar spruces and firs of New Hampshire's mountains, but something older and more twisted, with bark that seemed to move when viewed peripherally and branches that clicked together in rhythms that had nothing to do with the wind. "We need to find shelter," Jennifer announced, her lips already showing the pale blue tinge of hypothermia's early stages. "Build a fire. Wait out the storm." Sarah nodded emphatically, teeth chattering as she fumbled with her camera controls. "There," she pointed to a small clearing about 50 yards off what we hoped was still the trail. "Looks protected." The clearing felt wrong the moment we entered it. Perfectly circular, about 30 feet across, with dead grass that crunched underfoot despite the falling snow. No trees grew within its boundaries, though the forest pressed close on all sides like curious spectators. In the center sat a ring of blackened stones that clearly hadn't been placed by nature. "Someone's been here before," David observed, kneeling beside the fire ring. He scraped away snow and ash, revealing bones beneath, small ones, bird-sized, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "We should find somewhere else," I said, but David was already gathering dead wood from the forest edge, his movements quick and efficient. He'd always been the practical one among us, the problem solver, but there was something different about him now, something hungry in the way he arranged the bones rather than scattering them, in how he smiled as he built our fire directly on top of whatever ritual had been performed here before. The flames caught immediately, burning blue-green instead of normal orange, and gave off no discernible heat despite rising 6 feet into the darkening sky. We huddled around it anyway, more for psychological comfort than physical warmth, and tried to pretend that everything was normal. Jennifer attempted to call for help on her satellite phone, but the device couldn't acquire a signal despite showing clear sky above. Sarah's camera had developed a disturbing habit of taking pictures on its own, the flash firing randomly and illuminating things that weren't there when we looked directly. My watch had stopped at 3:33 p.m., though I knew we'd been hiking well past sunset. "We should take shifts keeping watch," Jennifer suggested, pulling out her sleeping bag. "2 people sleep while 2 stay awake." David volunteered for first watch along with me, which I appreciated until I saw the way he stared into the flames, not at them, but through them, as if watching something moving within the supernatural fire. His pupils had dilated completely despite the bright light, and when he spoke, his voice carried an echo that seemed to come from somewhere deep underground. "Do you ever think about what it would taste like?" he asked around midnight, never taking his eyes off the fire. What would taste like?" "Human flesh." He said it casually, conversationally, the way he might have asked about the weather. "I mean, we eat other mammals all the time. Cows, pigs, deer. We're just another kind of meat, really." The temperature around our fire dropped another 10 degrees, though the flames continued reaching toward the sky with unnatural intensity. I could see my breath forming clouds that seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should have allowed, and somewhere in the forest beyond our clearing, something large was moving through the underbrush. "That's a fucked up thing to think about, David." He finally looked at me and his eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. "Is it?" "We're lost, Mike. Really lost. Our food's going to run out eventually. What if we don't find our way back? Before I could respond, a scream echoed from the forest. High, piercing, and undeniably human. It came from the direction we'd approached the clearing, but distorted somehow, as if the sound was being stretched through dimensions we couldn't perceive. Jennifer and Sarah jolted awake, their faces pale and frightened in the dancing light of our impossible fire. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, clutching her camera like a protective talisman. Another scream answered her, closer this time, and definitely female. Someone was out there in the darkness, someone in terrible distress. The sound raised every primitive alarm my DNA had evolved over millions of years of avoiding predators, and my body flooded with adrenaline so intense I could taste copper. "We have to help them," Jennifer said, already pulling on her boots. "No." David's voice carried absolute authority, and something else. Satisfaction, perhaps. "We stay here. We don't know what's out there. Someone could be dying." "Someone probably is," he agreed and smiled. The screams continued for 37 minutes. I know because I counted every second on my stopped watch, praying for them to end while simultaneously dreading the silence that would inevitably follow. They weren't random cries of distress, I realized as they went on. They followed a pattern, a rhythm, like some obscene call-and-response ritual being performed in the darkness beyond our sight. When they finally stopped, the silence was so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums with physical weight. No wind, no settling snow, no night sounds of any kind. Even our fire had stopped crackling, though it continued burning with that eerie blue-green light. "I'm going to get more wood," David announced, standing and stretching as if he hadn't just listened to someone being tortured to death in the forest around us. "Don't go out there," Jennifer pleaded. "Please. Something's wrong. Something's really, really wrong." But he was already walking toward the tree line, moving with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly where he was going. "Be right back," he called over his shoulder, and then the darkness swallowed him completely. We waited, and waited, and waited. My watch remained frozen at 3:33, but my internal clock suggested David had been gone for over an hour when we heard him calling from the forest. "Mike, Jen, Sarah, I found something. Come help me." His voice came from at least 3 different directions simultaneously, which should have been impossible. Sound doesn't work that way, doesn't split and multiply and echo from places the speaker isn't standing. But we heard him clearly from the north, south, and east sides of our clearing, all speaking the exact same words at the exact same moment. "That's not David," Sarah whispered, her camera clutched so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Of course it's David," Jennifer argued, but she made no move to leave the fire circle. "Who else would it be?" "David, where are you?" I called into the darkness and immediately regretted it when my voice seemed to be absorbed by the trees without producing any echo at all. "Over here," came the response, still from multiple directions. "I found the trail! Come on!" Jennifer stood up, shouldering her pack. "We can't just leave him out there." "We can't go into the woods either," Sarah countered. "Something happened to him, something bad." "Mike!" David's voice again, but this time from directly behind me, close enough that I should have felt his breath on my neck. I spun around but saw only empty air and the edge of our firelight. "Mike, help me, I'm hurt." The desperation in his voice, the pain, it sounded so real, so genuinely David, that I almost took a step toward the source. Almost. But something in my lizard brain, some ancient survival instinct honed by a million years of avoiding things that hunted humans in the dark, kept my feet planted firmly within the circle of stones. "If you're hurt, come back to the fire," I called. "We can see you better here." Silence stretched for several heartbeats, and then David's laughter drifted from the trees. Not the warm, infectious laugh I'd known for years, but something cold and hungry that made my teeth ache. "I can't," he said, and now his voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the trees themselves. "I can't come back. Not the way I am now." Sarah whimpered and pressed closer to Jennifer, her camera firing off random flashes that illuminated nothing but empty forest and falling snow. The pictures she was inadvertently taking would later show shapes moving between the trees, elongated shadows that weren't cast by anything visible, but in that moment we were too terrified to look at the display screen. "What do you mean?" Jennifer called, though her voice cracked with fear. "I'm changing," David replied, and the words seemed to bypass my ears entirely and settle directly into my bones like vibrations from some massive, distant drum. "I'm becoming what this place wants me to become. What I've always wanted to become. Deep down." The fire flickered then, the blue-green flames dimming for just a moment, and in that brief darkness I saw something moving at the edge of the clearing. Tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that bent at too many joints and eyes that reflected our firelight like polished coins. It stood upright like a man, but wrong somehow, as if someone had tried to recreate human anatomy from a vague description rather than direct observation. When the flames brightened again, it was gone. "David, come back to the fire," I pleaded, hating how my voice shook. "Whatever's happening, we can figure it out together." "Oh, Mike," he said, and his voice was definitely closer now, circling our clearing like a predator testing its prey's defenses. "I am coming back. Just not the way you expect." We huddled together around that supernatural fire for the rest of the night, taking turns trying to sleep while the others kept watch. But sleep was impossible with David's voice drifting through the trees every few minutes, sometimes pleading for help, sometimes laughing, sometimes whispering secrets that made my skin crawl, intimate details about my childhood, my fears, my dreams that only David could have known. Around what should have been dawn, though the sky remained the same deep gray it had been since we entered the clearing, footsteps began circling us. Slow, deliberate, just beyond the reach of our firelight. The stride was wrong, too long, with pauses between steps that suggested the walker was moving on legs that no longer bent at normal angles. "David," Jennifer whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not anymore," came the reply, and the voice was David's but stretched thin, as if being spoken through a throat that had been fundamentally altered. "But don't worry, I'll always be your friend, all of you, forever and ever." Something stepped into our firelight then, and my mind refused to process what I was seeing for several crucial seconds. It had David's face, David's hair, David's general size and build, but his arms hung nearly to his knees, the fingers elongated into black claws that clicked against each other as he moved. His legs bent backward at the knee, giving him a disturbing, bird-like gait. And his mouth stretched far too wide, revealing rows of yellowed teeth that belonged in the jaws of something that had never been human. "Miss me?" he asked, and when he smiled, his lips split at the corners, extending his grin well past the normal boundaries of human anatomy. Sarah screamed and triggered her camera's flash, and for just an instant, the thing that had been David was illuminated in harsh white light. What I saw in that frozen moment burned itself into my memory with such intensity that I still wake up seeing it 15 months later. His skin had taken on a gray, mottled appearance, like meat that had been left too long in a freezer. His eyes were completely black, not just the pupils but the entire visible surface, and they reflected our fire like pools of oil. And there were symbols carved into his forehead, crude, angular marks that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. "Don't look at me like that," David said, tilting his head at an angle no human neck could manage. "This is better. I can smell your fear now, taste it in the air. I can hear your heartbeats from 100 yards away. I know things now, Mike. Wonderful, terrible things." Jennifer grabbed a burning branch from our fire and held it between us and the thing that wore David's face. "Stay back. Whatever you are, stay back." David Thing laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with wind through dead leaves. "Fire can't hurt me anymore. Nothing can hurt me anymore. But I can hurt you. Oh, the things I can do to you now. It took a step closer, and I smelled something like spoiled meat mixed with wet earth and something else. Something sweet and cloying that reminded me of the funeral home where we'd held services for my younger brother 3 years earlier. The grief I'd carried since Tommy's death, the guilt over not being there when he needed me, came flooding back with such intensity that I couldn't breathe. "I know about Tommy," David Thing whispered, reading my thoughts as easily as text on a page. "I know how you blame yourself. How you think if you'd been a better big brother he never would have gotten into that car with those drunk kids. I can make that stop hurting, Mike. I can make everything stop hurting." "Shut up," I managed, but my voice came out as a broken whimper. "He screamed your name when they pulled him from the wreckage. Did you know that? Where's Mike? Where's my big brother?" That's what he kept asking, even as they were loading him into the ambulance, even as he was dying. The lie hit me like a physical blow, even though I knew it was a lie. Tommy had died instantly, according to the medical examiner. He hadn't suffered, hadn't called for me, hadn't blamed me for not being there. But grief doesn't listen to logic, and the thing that had been David knew exactly which psychological scars to probe. "I can bring him back," it continued, stepping closer despite Jennifer's makeshift torch. "I know how now. All you have to do is let me touch you. Just for a second. Let me share what I've learned." Sarah was backing away from the fire now, her camera hanging forgotten around her neck, her face white with terror. "This isn't happening. This isn't real. People don't just change like that." "Oh, but they do," David Thing said, swiveling its head toward her with serpentine smoothness. "When they're hungry enough. When they want something badly enough. I've been hungry my whole life, Sarah. Hungry for more, for better, for everything I deserved but never got. And now I'm full, so wonderfully, satisfyingly full." It opened its mouth wider than any human mouth should open, and inside I could see not teeth and tongue but a writhing mass of darkness that seemed to extend infinitely inward. Something moved within that darkness. Pale shapes that might have been faces, or hands, or pieces of things that had once been alive. Jennifer swung her burning branch at the creature, and it simply reached out with those impossibly long arms and caught the makeshift weapon in its clawed hand. The flames went out instantly, not gradually but all at once, as if they'd never existed. "Now, that's just rude," David Thing said mildly, and before any of us could react, it grabbed Jennifer by the throat and lifted her off the ground with one hand. What happened next took maybe 5 seconds, but exists in my memory as a series of still photographs, each one burned into my consciousness with perfect, horrible clarity. Jennifer's feet kicking frantically, 6 inches off the ground, her hands clawing at the creature's wrist, leaving bloody scratches that healed instantly. David Thing's head tilting to one side as it studied her face with the detached curiosity of a child examining an insect. "I wonder what you taste like," it mused, and then its jaw unhinged like a snake's. Jennifer's scream cut short, the wet, tearing sound that followed. Blood, so much blood, spattering across the dead grass and hissing where it hit our supernatural fire. Sarah's camera firing off shot after shot, the flash illuminating a scene from hell. Jennifer's body hitting the ground, but not all of it. Not all of it. David Thing chewing thoughtfully, blood running down its chin, Jennifer's life essence painting its teeth red. "Gamey," it pronounced after swallowing, "but satisfying, very satisfying." Sarah broke then, her mind simply refusing to process what she'd witnessed. She turned and ran into the forest, crashing through underbrush and low-hanging branches, her panicked flight echoing through the trees until the darkness swallowed the sound. "She won't get far," David Thing observed, wiping blood from its mouth with the back of its hand. "I can smell her from miles away now. Fear has such a distinctive scent. I should have run, too. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the abomination that had consumed my best friend and murdered Jennifer in front of my eyes. But my legs wouldn't obey, wouldn't respond to the frantic commands my brain was sending. I could only stand there, trembling, staring at what remained of a girl I'd known for 2 years. "Why?" I whispered. David Thing cocked its head again, those black oil pool eyes reflecting the firelight. "Why what? Why did I change? Why did I kill her? Why am I going to kill you?" "All of it." It laughed again, that sound like breaking glass and dying wind. "Because I was hungry, Mike. Hungrier than you could possibly understand. I've been hungry my whole life. For success, for recognition, for power, for meaning. And this place, this wonderful place, it showed me how to satisfy that hunger. All I had to do was let it in, let it change me into what I was always meant to be." "You killed Jennifer." "I fed," it corrected, "the way everything feeds. The way you feed on plants and animals, the way plants feed on soil and sunlight, the way the earth feeds on everything that dies. I'm just higher up the food chain now." The fire behind me was dying, the blue-green flames shrinking down to mere flickers, and I realized that when it went out completely, I would be alone in the darkness with this thing that wore my best friend's face and had tasted human blood. "She tasted like memories," David Thing continued conversationally. "I can see her whole life now. First kiss, college applications, the fight she had with her mother last Christmas, her secret fear that she'd never amount to anything significant. It's all part of me now. She's part of me now." From somewhere in the forest came Sarah's scream, high and desperate and abruptly cut short. David Thing's head snapped in that direction, its nostrils flaring. "Ah, dessert," it murmured, and when it looked back at me, its expression was almost apologetic. "I should go collect her before she gets too far. But don't worry, Mike, I'll be back for you. We're going to have such wonderful conversations once you're part of me, too." It turned to leave, then paused at the edge of the firelight. "You know what the best part is? I remember being David. I remember caring about you, worrying about your feelings, wanting to be a good friend. But those emotions are just flavoring now, seasoning for the main course. I can still access them when I need to, still pretend to be human when it's convenient. But underneath, there's only the hunger, only the need to feed and grow and become more." Then it was gone, vanishing into the trees with inhuman speed, leaving me alone with Jennifer's remains and a fire that was rapidly burning down to embers. I had maybe 10 minutes before complete darkness claimed the clearing. 10 minutes to decide whether to follow Sarah's path and hope to help her, or to run in the opposite direction and save myself. 10 minutes to figure out how to survive until dawn in a forest that had already claimed 3 of my friends. I chose cowardice. I chose survival. I grabbed my pack and ran. Behind me, David Thing's laughter echoed through the trees, growing louder instead of fainter, as if it was somehow following me without moving from where it stood. The forest I fled through bore no resemblance to the one we'd hiked into that morning. The trees were older, more twisted, with bark that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat and branches that reached toward me with deliberate malevolence. The snow had stopped falling, but the temperature continued dropping until my breath came out in hard, crystalline clouds that shattered when they hit the ground. I ran for hours, or maybe minutes. Time had lost all meaning in that place between worlds where David had been transformed into something unspeakably hungry. My watch remained frozen at 3:33. My GPS showed only empty green space, and my compass spun wildly without ever settling on magnetic north. Twice I heard Sarah screaming in the distance, each time from a different direction, each time lasting just long enough to provide false hope before cutting off abruptly. By the third scream, I realized it wasn't Sarah at all, but David Thing calling to me, using her voice the way it had used David's earlier, trying to lure me into whatever trap it had prepared. I kept running. Eventually, after what felt like days but couldn't have been more than a few hours, I stumbled into another clearing, this one natural rather than perfectly circular. A small stream ran through the center, the water black as motor oil but moving with the familiar babbling sound of normal mountain brooks. I knelt beside it and splashed the liquid on my face, desperate for any sensation that felt real and solid and human. That's when I saw the backpacks. 3 of them, lined up neatly beside the stream like sleeping bags arranged around a campfire. 2 were brands I didn't recognize, but the third belonged to Sarah. I knew because she'd covered it with patches from every national park she'd ever visited. A colorful record of family vacations and solo adventures. Inside, I found her camera. The final photos were too dark to make out clearly, but the earlier ones from our hike told a story that made my hands shake as I scrolled through them. We were there in the first dozen shots. 4 friends grinning at the camera, mugging for Sarah's lens, completely oblivious to what was watching us from the forest. But in the background of every single photograph, partially concealed behind trees or rocks or patches of shadow, stood a tall, thin figure with 2 long arms and eyes that reflected the camera's flash like pools of oil. It had been following us since we left the parking lot, watching us, hunting us, choosing which one of us to claim first. I scrolled through more photos and found shots I knew Sarah hadn't taken deliberately, images captured when her camera fired randomly around our supernatural campfire. They showed David's transformation in horrifying detail, his arms elongating frame by frame, his spine curving into an inhuman arch, his mouth stretching into that impossibly wide grin. But the most disturbing photo was the last one, taken just moments before I'd found the camera. It showed me kneeling beside the stream, splashing black water on my face, completely unaware that David Thing was standing directly behind me, its clawed hands reaching toward my shoulders. I spun around, but saw only empty forest. "Surprise," David Thing whispered directly into my ear, and I felt its breath, cold as winter air and smelling of decay, against my neck. I rolled away just as those elongated claws slashed through the space where my head had been a moment before, coming up in a crouch with Sarah's camera clutched in my hands like a weapon. The flash went off automatically, and for one brilliant instant the creature was illuminated in harsh white light. It was worse than before. The transformation was progressing, making it less human with each passing hour. Its skin had taken on a bark-like texture, and what I had initially thought were carved symbols on its forehead were actually branches. Small twigs growing directly from its skull, adorned with leaves that moved without any wind to stir them. "You can't run forever, Mike," it said, advancing with that disturbing bird-like gait. "This forest belongs to me now. Every tree, every stream, every shadow. They're all part of me, and I'm part of them. You're in my body now, and I can feel every step you take." I backed toward the stream, clutching the camera. "What happened to you out there? What changed you?" "I found what I was looking for," it replied. "What I'd been searching for my whole life without knowing it. Purpose, meaning, a place in the natural order that actually makes sense. By becoming a monster? By becoming honest." Its mouth split into that impossible grin, revealing rows of teeth that looked increasingly like thorns. "Do you know what the first humans who lived in these mountains called creatures like me? Wendigo. The eternally hungry ones. They knew the truth, that some hungers can never be satisfied by ordinary food, ordinary pleasures, ordinary lives." It took another step closer, and I could see my reflection in its black eyes. Small, frightened, completely helpless. They tried to warn people with stories, with taboos, with rituals designed to keep the hungry from awakening. But stories get forgotten, Mike. Taboos get ignored, and the hungry never really sleep. "David, please. Somewhere inside that thing, you're still my friend. You're still—" "I ate her, Mike." The words hit me like a physical blow. I ate Sarah while she was still alive, still conscious, still hoping you might save her. I held her down and opened her up and pulled out her heart while it was still beating, and it was the most beautiful thing I've ever experienced. The lie was so casual, so matter-of-fact that for a moment I almost believed it. But then I remembered the photos on Sarah's camera, remembered that the creature had been behind me when I found her backpack, which meant she couldn't have been captured yet. "You're lying," I said. "You haven't found her." Its grin faltered for just a moment, and in that instant I saw something that might have been frustration flicker across its inhuman features. Smart boy. Too smart for your own good. She got away from you. Temporarily. But this forest goes on forever, Mike. Literally forever. Space doesn't work the same way here. Time doesn't work the same way. She'll run until her legs give out, then crawl until her hands are bloody stumps, then lie there while I take my time deciding which piece to eat first. I triggered the camera's flash again, and David Thing flinched away from the light with a hiss like steam escaping from a kettle. Interesting. It didn't like the bright illumination, or maybe there was something about being photographed that disrupted whatever supernatural force was animating it. You're afraid of this, I realized, holding up the camera. I'm not afraid of anything anymore, it snarled, but it made no move to come closer while I had the camera pointed in its direction. Then, why won't you look at it? Instead of answering, it began circling me like a wolf, staying just outside the range of the camera's flash. Do you want to know the real reason I brought us here, Mike? The real reason I was so insistent about this particular trail? I kept the camera trained on it as best I could while it moved, but it was hard to track something that moved with such fluid, inhuman grace. You didn't bring us here. We decided together. I planted the idea, spent months talking about this hike, showing you pictures, describing how peaceful and remote it would be. Because I knew what was waiting here. I could feel it calling to me, even before I understood what it was. The confession hit me like ice water in my veins. You planned this, all of it. I dreamed about this place for years, Mike. Dreamed about the clearing with the stone circle, about the fire that burns without heat, about the hunger that lives in the trees. And every time I woke up, I was more dissatisfied with my ordinary human life. It stopped circling and faced me directly, its black eyes reflecting the starlight filtering through the canopy above. I brought you here because I knew I'd need fuel for the transformation, energy to power the change from what I was to what I'm becoming. Your fear, your pain, your life force, it's all just food for the new me. And Jennifer? Sarah? What about them? Appetizers, it said simply. You were always going to be the main course, Mike. My best friend, my closest companion. When I consume you, I'll have access to every shared memory, every inside joke, every moment of trust and affection we ever experienced. I'll become you, in a sense. The perfect predator disguised as the perfect friend. I backed up another step and felt my heel splash into the stream. The water was shockingly cold, even through my hiking boots, and for some reason the sensation brought a moment of clarity to my terror-fogged mind. Water. Running water. In every folklore tradition I could remember, creatures like wendigos couldn't cross running water. It was worth a try. Come and get me, I taunted, raising the camera. If you're so hungry, what are you waiting for? David Thing's grin widened until the corners of its mouth nearly reached its ears. I was hoping you'd make this interesting. It launched itself toward me with inhuman speed, covering the 15 feet between us in a single bound. But as it reached the edge of the stream, something invisible seemed to slam into it mid-air, sending it tumbling backward to land in a heap of two long limbs and snapping branches. Son of a bitch, it growled, picking itself up and brushing dead leaves from its gray, mottled skin. I forgot about that particular limitation. Running water, I said, feeling the first spark of hope I'd experienced since this nightmare began. You can't cross it. Temporarily inconvenient, it admitted. But this stream has to end somewhere, and when it does, I'll be waiting. It was right, of course. Mountain streams weren't infinite barriers. They pooled into ponds, disappeared into underground channels, or simply petered out as their sources dried up. But for now, the narrow band of flowing water between us was the only thing keeping me alive. There's something else you should know, David Thing said conversationally, settling into a crouch at the stream's edge like a patient predator, about what happened to your brother. Don't? The word came out as a growl. I was there that night, Mike, at the party. I saw Tommy leave with those drunk kids. saw him get into their car, and I didn't stop him." "You're lying." "I could have stopped him. Could have offered to drive him home myself or called you to come pick him up. But I was having too much fun, too drunk to care about your little brother's safety. So I let him go. Even knowing it was lying, even knowing it was trying to manipulate me with guilt and grief, the words hit their target. Because deep down, I'd always suspected that someone could have prevented Tommy's death if they'd just cared enough to intervene. "I've carried that guilt for 3 years," it continued. "Watched you blame yourself when the real fault was mine. And do you know what the wonderful thing is? When I eat you, when I absorb your memories and personality, that guilt will finally make sense. It will become part of a larger pattern of hunger and satisfaction." I raised the camera and triggered the flash, and David Thing recoiled with that same hissing sound. But this time I noticed something else. In the split second of illumination, I could see through it. Not completely, but enough to make out the trees behind its semi-transparent form. It was fading, or becoming less solid. Or maybe the camera was somehow disrupting whatever force held its transformed shape together. "Interesting," I murmured, checking the camera's battery indicator. Still had about 60% charge, enough for maybe 30 more flashes. "That won't work forever," David Thing observed, apparently reading my thoughts. "And I don't need to be solid to kill you. I just need to be patient." As if to demonstrate its point, it reached toward the stream without actually touching the water, and I felt an invisible pressure against my chest. Not enough to knock me down, but enough to make breathing difficult. "Telekinesis," I gasped. "Among other things. The change brings many gifts, Mike. Enhanced senses, supernatural strength, the ability to manipulate matter with focused will, and the hunger, always the hunger, growing stronger with each life consumed." The pressure increased, and I stumbled backward through the stream until I was standing on the opposite bank. David Thing stood up with fluid grace, its 2 long arms hanging nearly to its knees. "But now you're on my side of the water," it pointed out with obvious satisfaction. I looked down and realized it was right. In my panic to escape the telekinetic assault, I'd crossed to the same side of the stream where the creature waited. "Rookie mistake," it observed, and then it was moving toward me again, covering ground with that disturbing, bird-like gait. I triggered the camera's flash, and David Thing stumbled as the light hit it, its form flickering like a bad television reception. Taking advantage of its momentary disorientation, I dove to the side and rolled behind a large granite boulder that jutted from the stream bank. "You can't hide forever," it called, its voice echoing strangely in the confined space between the rock and the water. "This is my domain now, Mike. Every stone knows my touch, every tree bends to my will." To emphasize its point, the branches of a nearby oak began reaching toward my hiding spot, their twigs extending like grasping fingers. I triggered another flash, and the branches recoiled as if burned. 65% battery remaining. I had to find a more permanent solution, and fast. That's when I heard Sarah's voice, faint but unmistakably real this time, calling from somewhere upstream. "Mike! Mike! Where are you?" David Thing heard it too, its head snapping toward the sound with predatory focus. "Ah, there she is. I was wondering when she'd find the courage to come looking for help." "Sarah, run!" I shouted. "Get out of here. Find the road." "I can't," came her reply, closer now. "I'm hurt. I can't walk." David Thing's grin returned, wider than ever. Injured prey, my favorite kind. The fear is so much more intense when they know they can't escape. It turned away from my hiding spot and began moving upstream toward Sarah's voice, its movements liquid and predatory. I had a choice to make: stay hidden and let it claim another victim, or follow and try to help despite being completely outmatched. I chose to follow. Moving as quietly as possible, I crept along the stream bank, using trees and rocks for cover while keeping David Thing in sight. It was easy to track. The creature's supernatural presence seemed to affect the forest around it, making leaves curl and branches wither as it passed. I found Sarah about a quarter mile upstream, sitting with her back against a massive pine tree, her right leg bent at an angle that made my stomach clench. Compound fracture, bone protruding through torn fabric and flesh, blood pooling beneath her. "Oh, God, Sarah," I whispered, forgetting stealth in my horror at her condition. She looked up at me with eyes that were glazed with pain and shock. "Mike, is that really you? I've been seeing things, hearing voices." "It's me," I confirmed, glancing around nervously. Where was David Thing? It had been heading in this direction, but I didn't see it anywhere. "Something's wrong with David," she gasped. He changed into something awful. I know, we have to get you out of here." I knelt beside her and examined the break more closely. The bone had punched through the skin about 6 inches below her knee, and she was losing blood at a rate that suggested arterial damage. Even if we could somehow reach medical help, she might not survive the journey. "Can you move at all?" She shook her head weakly. "Fell down a ravine about an hour ago. Thought I heard you calling, so I tried to climb up, but the rocks gave way." That's when I realized what had happened. David Thing had been using my voice to lure her into this trap, leading her to an unstable slope where gravity would do most of the work. Now she was too injured to flee. Perfect bait for both of us. "We're going to get out of this," I lied, helping her shift into a more comfortable position against the tree trunk. "Both of us." "Mike," she whispered, gripping my arm with surprising strength. "There's something else. While I was running, I think I found the way out." Hope flared in my chest. "What do you mean?" "About half a mile that way," she pointed northeast. "There's a road, a real road with telephone lines and everything. I could see headlights moving." "Are you sure?" "Positive. I was trying to reach it when I fell." Her eyes were starting to lose focus, shock and blood loss taking their toll. "You have to go, Mike. Get help." I started to stand, then stopped. "I'm not leaving you. You have to. I'm not going anywhere with this leg, and if you stay, we'll both die." Before I could argue, David Thing's voice drifted through the trees from downstream. "Mike? Sarah? Where did you go? I have something wonderful to show you." Sarah's grip on my arm tightened. "Go, please." "He's coming," I whispered, looking around desperately for somewhere to hide her. "If I can distract him, lead him away." "No." Her voice was getting weaker, but her eyes were clear and determined. "Listen to me. That thing isn't David anymore. Not really. It's wearing his face, using his memories, but underneath it's just hunger. And it won't stop with us. Sarah, if it gets out of these woods, if it reaches civilization, it'll feed on everyone it meets. Children, families, anyone unlucky enough to cross its path." She fumbled in her jacket pocket and pulled out something that glinted in the starlight. A small camping knife, the blade no more than 3 inches long. "What are you doing?" "Buying you time," she said simply, and before I could stop her, she dragged the knife across her throat in one quick motion. Blood fountained from the wound, far too much blood, and Sarah's eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible. But somehow she managed one final whisper. "Run." I ran. Behind me, David Thing's roar of rage and frustration echoed through the forest, the sound of a predator that had just been cheated of its prey. I didn't look back, didn't slow down, just crashed through underbrush and low-hanging branches while Sarah's sacrifice bought me precious minutes to escape. The road, when I finally reached it, was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Real asphalt, real painted lines, real civilization stretching in both directions under a canopy of normal pine trees that didn't writhe with supernatural malevolence. I collapsed on the yellow center line and sobbed with relief, knowing that I'd somehow made it out of that impossible forest alive. A state trooper found me 20 minutes later, hypothermic and babbling about monsters and possessed friends and supernatural fires that burned without heat. They took me to the hospital in North Conway, where I spent 3 days under psychiatric observation while search and rescue teams combed the White Mountain National Forest for my missing companions. They never found the trail we'd hiked, never found the circular clearing with its ring of blackened stones. Never found Jennifer's remains or Sarah's body or any trace of David thing stalking through trees that existed somewhere between dimensions. What they did find was David's Subaru in the parking area at the end of Zealand Road, exactly where we'd left it. The keys were still in his pocket, his wallet still contained his driver's license and credit cards, and according to the medical examiner, he'd been dead for at least 18 hours when they discovered his body. Hypothermia, they concluded. He'd wandered away from our campsite, gotten lost in the storm, and frozen to death. A tragic but unfortunately common occurrence in New Hampshire's mountains. They found his body curled beneath a fallen log about 2 miles from the parking area. His face peaceful and unmarked, his limbs normal human proportions. No claws, no impossible grin, no symbols carved into his forehead. Just my best friend since college, dead from exposure. I tried to tell them about the creature, about what I'd witnessed in that clearing between worlds, but the psychiatrists and social workers and well-meaning relatives all had the same explanation. Trauma-induced hallucinations brought on by hypothermia and the stress of watching my friends die. Post-traumatic stress disorder, they called it. Survivor's guilt. Psychotic break with reality. They prescribed medications and therapy sessions and support groups for people who'd experienced similar outdoor tragedies. And eventually, because I wanted to get on with my life and because no one would believe the truth anyway, I learned to nod and agree and pretend that I understood the difference between reality and delusion. But I know what I saw in those woods. I know what David became, what force claimed him and transformed him into something that hunted human prey with intelligence and malicious joy. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling outside my apartment windows, I hear his laughter echoing through the darkness. The official reports say that Jennifer Williams and Sarah Rodriguez are still missing, presumably victims of the same storm that killed David Jones. Their families have never stopped hoping they might be found alive. And every few months I get calls from private investigators or concerned relatives asking if I've remembered any additional details that might help locate them. I tell them what they want to hear, that my memories of those 3 days are fragmented and unreliable, that the hypothermia and trauma have left gaps I'll probably never recover. I don't mention the photographs on Sarah's camera, or the sound Jennifer made when David Thing lifted her off the ground, or the way Sarah's blood looked black in the starlight as it pooled beneath her body. But sometimes I dream about that impossible forest, about trails that exist on no map, and creatures that wear the faces of people we trust. And in those dreams, I can hear David calling to me from somewhere beyond the tree line, his voice patient and hungry and eternally unsatisfied. "Come back, Mike," he whispers in my sleep. "Come back and let me finish what I started." And the terrible thing is, some part of me wants to answer that call. Some part of me is tired of pretending that the normal world makes sense after seeing what really lurks in the spaces between civilization and wilderness. Some part of me is getting hungry too. I still live in New Hampshire, though I've moved closer to the coast where the forests are younger and the trees don't whisper secrets when the wind picks up. I work as a software engineer now, spending my days in climate-controlled offices surrounded by concrete and steel and all the comforting illusions of human dominance over the natural world. But every October, when the leaves begin to turn and the first snow dusts the peaks of the White Mountains, I feel that old restlessness stirring, that desire to strap on a backpack and disappear into the wilderness where cell phones don't work and GPS units show only empty green space. I fight it. I make excuses, find reasons to stay busy, schedule extra therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez, who thinks my outdoor anxiety is a perfectly normal response to traumatic events. But the hunger is growing stronger each year. And someday, probably soon, I'm going to stop fighting it and answer David's call. When that happens, when I finally walk back into those woods that exist somewhere between dimensions, I don't think I'll be coming back out. At least, not as anything that used to be human. The thing that wears my face might visit my family occasionally, might keep up the pretense of normal life for a while, but underneath, there will only be the hunger, only the eternal, gnawing need to feed. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 25 years old. This happened in the White Mountain National Forest, about 15 miles northeast of Mount Washington in New Hampshire, during the third week of October 2023. And it's still happening every day in the spaces between what we think we know and what actually hunts us in the dark. My name is James Anderson, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire, near the abandoned settlement of Livermore, where the old logging roads disappear into miles of uncharted wilderness. Michael Williams and I had been planning this backpacking trip for months. We were both software engineers, spending our days hunched over computers in Boston's financial district, and we desperately needed to reconnect with something real. The plan was simple: 5 days hiking the forgotten trails around Mount Kerrigan, camping in areas where cell towers couldn't reach and GPS signals grew weak among the dense canopy of ancient pines. Mike was the outdoorsman between us, lean, bearded, with calloused hands that knew how to tie proper knots and start fires without matches. I was the worrier, the one who packed extra batteries and backup maps, who triple-checked our route and filed detailed plans with the Park Service. We balanced each other out, or so I thought. The first sign something was wrong came on our second day, just past the defunct Livermore Falls where the old railroad bridge rusts over Black Brook. We'd been hiking since dawn, our boots crunching through patches of early autumn snow that shouldn't have existed in September. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight, and our breath came out in visible puffs despite the weather report promising mild conditions. GPS is acting weird, Mike said, stopping to check his device. The screen flickered between our actual location and somewhere 50 miles north, near the Canadian border. Must be the tree cover. I pulled out my backup unit, but it showed the same erratic readings. The electronic compass spun lazily in circles before settling on magnetic north, then immediately swinging to point deeper into the forest. Neither of us mentioned how the shadows seemed too long for afternoon, or how the sun appeared to be setting in the wrong direction. We made camp that night in a clearing beside Hancock Brook, where the water ran cold and clear over smooth granite stones. The sound should have been soothing, but there was something else underneath it. A rhythmic scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood. Mike built our fire while I set up the tent, and for a few hours everything felt normal. We ate our dehydrated meals, shared a flask of whiskey, and Mike told the same stories about his ex-girlfriend that he'd been telling for 3 years. But when I crawled into my sleeping bag around 10, the scratching grew louder. It seemed to come from the trees surrounding our campsite, always just at the edge of the firelight's reach. I lay awake, listening, my breath fogging in the suddenly frigid air inside the tent. "You hear that?" I whispered to Mike. His breathing was deep and even. Too even. I reached over and shook his shoulder, but he didn't respond. His skin felt ice cold through his sleeping bag, and when I pressed my ear to his chest, his heartbeat was so slow I could count several seconds between each thud. The scratching stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard footsteps circling our tent. Slow, deliberate steps that paused every few feet, as if something was studying us. The footsteps were wrong. Too heavy in some places, too light in others, with an odd dragging quality that made me think of broken bones. I held my breath and listened as whatever it was completed 3 full circles around our camp before finally moving away into the forest. Only then did Mike's breathing return to normal, and only then could I finally sleep. Dawn came too early and too bright. I woke to find our fire completely cold, not even embers remaining, though I was certain Mike had banked it properly the night before. More disturbing was the discovery that our food bag, which we'd hung from a tree branch 12 feet off the ground, was sitting neatly beside the dead fire, completely untouched but somehow moved. Mike emerged from the tent, stretching and yawning, claiming he'd slept better than he had in months. When I told him about the footsteps and the moved food, he laughed it off. "You've been watching too many horror movies, Jimmy. Bears are smart. They can figure out how to get food bags down without making a mess." But there were no bear tracks in the soft earth around our camp. No tracks of any kind except for our own boot prints from the previous evening. Even the places where I'd heard the heavy footsteps were unmarked. We broke camp and continued north along an old logging road that shouldn't have existed on any of our maps. Mike insisted he'd scouted this route online, but when I checked our paper maps, the road simply wasn't there. The GPS continued to glitch, placing us alternately in New Hampshire, Quebec, and once, inexplicably, in northern Alaska. "Technology," Mike said with a shrug. "Can't trust it out here." The forest around us grew thicker and darker as we climbed. The trees were wrong somehow. Massive pines that must have been centuries old, their trunks scarred with deep gouges that formed almost geometric patterns. The undergrowth was sparse, as if nothing could take root in the acidic soil beneath the ancient canopy. By noon, we should have reached the summit trail, but instead we found ourselves in a valley that didn't exist on any map. A creek ran through the center, its water so clear it seemed almost unnatural. Mike knelt beside it and cupped his hands for a drink. "Don't," I said, though I couldn't explain why. The water looked perfect, but it carried no scent. No mineral smell, no organic decay, nothing that suggested it was part of a living ecosystem. "Paranoid," Mike said, but he didn't drink. Instead, he stood and looked around the valley with an expression I'd never seen before. A hungry, calculating look that made my skin crawl. "We should go back," I said. "Retrace our steps to the main trail." "We're fine," Mike replied, but his voice sounded strange. Flatter. "Just keep going north." North led us deeper into the valley, following a game trail that appeared and disappeared at random intervals. The trees grew closer together, their branches interlocking overhead until we walked in permanent twilight. I checked my watch repeatedly, but the hands seemed frozen at 2:17, though the light continued to fade around us. We should have made camp before dark, but dark never seemed to fully arrive. Instead, we found ourselves in a perpetual dusk that made it impossible to judge time or distance. My headlamp flickered weakly when I tried to use it, though I'd installed fresh batteries that morning. "Mike," I said, stopping on the trail, "we need to talk about what's happening here." But when I turned around, Mike was gone. I called his name until my throat was raw, but the forest swallowed my voice without even an echo. I backtracked along the trail, looking for any sign of where he might have left the path, but the ground was too hard to hold footprints. It was as if he'd simply vanished between one step and the next. I set up my tent in a small clearing, built a fire with shaking hands, and waited. The scratching sounds returned with full dark, but now they were accompanied by something worse, a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was almost musical, like a lullaby sung by something that had never been human. Sleep came in fragments. I would doze off only to wake moments later, certain I'd heard Mike calling my name from somewhere in the forest. Each time I unzipped the tent to look, there was nothing but darkness and the endless humming. Morning brought no relief. The sun rose pale and distant, casting everything in a sickly gray light that revealed more of those strange gouges in the trees. They weren't random after all. They formed patterns, symbols that hurt to look at directly. When I tried to photograph them with my phone, the camera wouldn't focus, producing only blurred images that made my eyes water. I had two choices: continue forward in hopes of finding Mike, or turn back toward civilization. The rational part of my mind screamed to leave, to get help, to bring in search and rescue. But I couldn't abandon my best friend, not when he might be lost and injured somewhere ahead. The trail continued north, climbing steadily through terrain that made no geological sense. I passed outcroppings of black stone that gleamed like glass and pools of water so still they might have been solid obsidian. The humming grew stronger as I climbed, resonating in my bones until my teeth ached. I found Mike just before noon, standing at the edge of a cliff I hadn't seen approaching. He stood perfectly still, his back to me, looking out over a valley that plunged into depths the pale sun couldn't reach. "Mike!" I called, relief flooding through me. "Jesus, I've been looking everywhere for you." He turned slowly, and my relief transformed into something cold and crawling in my gut. It was Mike's face, Mike's body, Mike's familiar hiking clothes. But his eyes were wrong. Not the warm brown I remembered, but a pale, colorless gray that seemed to reflect light like an animal's. His smile was too wide, showing too many teeth. "Jimmy," he said, and even his voice was wrong. Too flat, too empty, like someone doing a poor impression of my friend. "I found something." "Where have you been? I looked for you all night." "All night?" Mike tilted his head with a jerky, unnatural motion. "I've been right here, waiting." The way he said waiting made my skin crawl. There was hunger in it, anticipation, like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "We need to get out of here," I said, taking a step backward. "Something's wrong with this place. The GPS, the maps, everything's fucked up." "Nothing's wrong," Mike said, still smiling that terrible smile. "Everything's perfect. Come and see." He gestured toward the cliff edge, but I couldn't see what he was pointing at. The valley below was lost in shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. "I'm not going near that edge," I said. "We're leaving, now." Mike's head tilted the other way, the movement too quick and sharp. "But Jimmy, I want to show you what I found. What found me." The emphasis on "found me" sent ice water through my veins. I took another step back, my hand moving instinctively to the bear spray clipped to my belt. "You're not Mike," I whispered. The thing wearing Mike's face laughed, and the sound was like wind through dead leaves. "Of course I am. Who else would I be?" But even as it spoke, its form began to shift. Mike's familiar features stretched and elongated, his jaw unhinging like a snake's. His fingers grew longer, ending in black claws that scraped against the stone. Most horrible of all, his eyes, those pale, reflective eyes, never changed, never blinked, never looked away from mine. I ran. I crashed through the forest with no thought of direction, branches tearing at my clothes and face. Behind me, I could hear something large moving through the trees, but it wasn't running. It was taking its time, confident that I had nowhere to go. The humming grew louder, seeming to come from everywhere at once. The very air vibrated with it, making my vision blur and my balance falter. I stumbled and fell, rolling down a steep slope until I fetched up against a massive pine. When I stopped moving, the forest was silent. I lay still for a long time, listening for any sound of pursuit. My heart hammered so hard I was sure it could be heard for miles, but nothing came after me. Slowly, carefully, I got to my feet and looked around. I was in another valley, this one filled with the remains of what looked like a logging camp. Rusted equipment lay scattered among the trees, and the skeletal framework of several buildings stood against the darkening sky. But these weren't modern ruins. The style was wrong, too old, as if they'd been abandoned for 50 years or more. My phone had no signal, but it did show the time. 3:47 p.m. Impossible. I'd been running for hours, but somehow only minutes had passed since I'd fled from the thing pretending to be Mike. I found shelter in the most intact building, a bunkhouse with 3 walls and most of a roof. As I set up my sleeping bag, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Mike was gone. The real Mike. Something had taken his place, something that knew enough about him to fool me initially but couldn't quite get the details right. But what? And why? The answer came with the sunset, when the humming returned stronger than ever. I peered through a gap in the wall and saw them coming through the trees. Figures that moved wrong, walked wrong, looked wrong. They were human-shaped but too tall, too thin, with elongated limbs that bent at impossible angles. Their eyes reflected the dying light like mirrors. At their head walked the thing that looked like Mike, still wearing his face but no longer bothering to fully maintain the illusion. Its limbs stretched and contracted as it moved, as if it couldn't quite remember how human joints were supposed to work. "Jimmy," it called in Mike's voice, though its mouth didn't move correctly with the words. "We know you're there. Come out and join us." The other figures spread out through the ruined camp, searching systematically. I pressed myself against the back wall of the bunkhouse and tried not to breathe. Through the gaps in the walls, I could see them moving past, not quite walking, not quite gliding, their feet barely seeming to touch the ground. One of them stopped directly outside my hiding spot. I could hear it breathing, though the sound was wrong. Too wet, too ragged, like air passing through damaged lungs. It stood there for an eternity, and I was certain it could hear my heartbeat. Finally, mercifully, it moved on. I waited until long after the sounds of their search had faded before venturing out. The moon had risen, casting everything in stark silver light that revealed more of the camp's secrets. The buildings weren't just old. They were wrong. The proportions were off, the angles didn't quite match up, as if they'd been built by something that understood the concept of human architecture but had never actually seen it done correctly. Among the ruins, I found bones. Human bones, picked clean and arranged in careful patterns that made my eyes water to look at directly. They were old, decades old at least, but there were too many of them. Far too many for a simple logging camp. And carved into the trees around the clearing were more of those symbols, the ones that hurt to look at. But now, in the moonlight, I could see they weren't random at all. They told a story, and as I followed them from tree to tree, the story became clear. This wasn't a logging camp. It was a feeding ground. The symbols showed figures, human figures, being led into the forest by things that weren't human. The carvings grew more elaborate and disturbing as they progressed, showing the fate of those who had been lured here. Some were transformed, changed into the pale, elongated creatures I'd seen. Others were simply consumed, their bones added to the careful arrangements in the camp. The final carving on a tree at the far edge of the clearing showed something else, a single human figure running away, escaping into the forest. Below it, scratched in more recent cuts, was a word in English: bait. I was bait. Mike had been taken, transformed, and sent back to lead me here. But why? What made me special? The answer came with a sound I'd been dreading. Mike's voice calling my name from the edge of the clearing. "Jimmy, I'm hurt. I need help." This time it sounded exactly right. The perfect inflection, the slight rasp he got when he was tired, even the way he pronounced my name. If I hadn't seen what it really was, I would have run to help him without hesitation. "Please," the voice continued, and now I could hear pain in it, fear, desperation. "Something happened to me. I don't remember. I'm bleeding." The worst part was that some small part of me wanted to believe it, wanted to think that somehow the real Mike had escaped, that everything I'd seen was some kind of hallucination brought on by altitude sickness, or bad water, or simple fear. But I'd seen the bones. I'd seen the carvings. I knew what was really out there. I gathered my gear as quietly as possible and slipped out the back of the bunkhouse. If I could make it to the tree line without being seen, I might be able to circle around and find my way back to the main trail. It was a long shot, but it was better than staying here and eventually giving in to the thing wearing Mike's voice. I made it 50 yards before they found me. The not Mike stepped out from behind a tree directly in front of me, still wearing my friend's face but no longer bothering to hide what it really was. Its limbs were too long now, its fingers ending in black claws that gleamed in the moonlight. When it smiled, I could see rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Going somewhere, Jimmy?" "You're not Mike," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I'm more Mike than Mike ever was," it replied. "I have all his memories, all his thoughts, all his feelings about you. Did you know he was jealous of your job, your salary? He thought you looked down on him." The words hit like physical blows because they contained just enough truth to be believable. Mike had made comments over the years, little jokes about my fancy apartment, my corporate clothes. I'd always thought they were harmless, but maybe. "He never said any of that," I said. "He never said it to you," the thing replied. "But I can feel it all, every petty resentment, every moment of envy. That's what makes us so good at this. We don't just wear their faces, we become them, completely. All their love, all their hate, all their hunger. It took a step closer, and I could smell it now, the scent of old meat and wet earth, of things that grew in dark places. "The hunger is the best part," it continued. "Mike was always hungry, you know. Hungry for success, for recognition, for things he couldn't have. But that's nothing compared to what I feel now. What we all feel." The other creatures emerged from the trees around us, forming a loose circle. Up close, I could see that some of them had once been human. Their transformations were incomplete, leaving them caught between states: elongated limbs, pale skin, those terrible reflective eyes, but still recognizably the people they had once been. "You're Wendigo," I whispered, the word coming from some half-remembered folklore. The not Mike laughed, a sound like wind through bones. "Is that what you call us? We are much older than your stories, Jimmy. We were here when the first humans crossed the ice, and will be here when the last one dies. We are hunger incarnate, and we feed on more than flesh. What do you want with me?" "Want?" It tilted its head with that jerky, unnatural motion. "We don't want anything. We simply are. But you're special. Most people who wander into our territory are just food, but you saw through the illusion. You recognized that I wasn't really Mike. That's rare." The circle of creatures moved closer, their eyes reflecting the moonlight like a dozen pale stars. "So, we're going to keep you," the not Mike continued. "Transform you slowly, let you keep your awareness throughout the process. You'll make an excellent hunter, Jimmy. All that paranoia, all that attention to detail, perfect for luring others into our embrace." The transformation had already begun, I realized. The wrongness I'd been feeling, the way time seemed to move strangely, the increasing hunger that gnawed at my stomach despite the fear, all symptoms of whatever they'd done to me. "How long?" I asked. "Days? Weeks?" "It varies. Mike took almost a month to fully change, but he fought it. You're already accepting it. I can see it in your eyes." It was right. Even as horror filled me, there was something else underneath it. A dark anticipation, a growing hunger that felt almost pleasant. I could feel my thoughts changing, becoming colder, more calculating. The idea of leading other hikers into this valley, of watching the realization dawn on their faces as they understood what was happening to them, sent a shiver of pleasure through me. No. I shook my head violently, trying to clear the alien thoughts. This wasn't me. This was what they were doing to me. But even as I fought it, I could feel my resistance weakening. It would be so much easier to just give in, to let the change happen, to become something that never felt fear or doubt or loneliness, only the pure, simple drive to hunt and feed. The not Mike sensed my wavering resolve and smiled wider. "That's it, Jimmy. Stop fighting. Let it happen." I almost did. The temptation was overwhelming, a tide of dark comfort that promised an end to all human suffering. But then I remembered something. The final carving on the tree, the word scratched below the image of the escaping human. Bait. Not all of the people who came here were consumed or transformed. Some escaped, and if they escaped, that meant there was still hope. I pulled the bear spray from my belt and triggered it directly into the not Mike's face. It shrieked and stumbled backward, clawing at its eyes. The other creatures hesitated, confused by this sudden resistance from their supposedly broken prey. I ran. The forest was a maze of shadows and reaching branches, but I no longer cared about direction or destination. I just ran, crashing through undergrowth and leaping over fallen logs, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the hunting pack. Behind me, I could hear them coming. Not the slow, confident pursuit of before, but something frantic and angry. The not Mike's shrieks had become a howling that was answered by voices throughout the forest, a symphony of hunger and rage that seemed to shake the very trees. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs shook until I couldn't take another step without collapsing. When I finally stopped, gasping and wheezing, I found myself back at the cliff where I'd first encountered the transformed Mike. The irony wasn't lost on me. After hours of desperate flight, I'd ended up exactly where I started. But something was different. The valley below, which had been lost in impenetrable shadow before, was now visible in the moonlight. And what I saw made my blood freeze. It wasn't a valley at all. It was a pit. A massive excavation that descended into the earth like an inverted mountain. And it was filled with them. Hundreds, maybe thousands of the pale creatures, all moving in complex patterns around structures that hurt to look at directly. At the center of it all was something vast and writhing, something that my mind refused to fully process. This was their nest, their breeding ground, their temple. And I was standing at its very edge. The howling grew closer. They would be here soon, and when they found me, there would be nowhere left to run. I looked down at the bear spray in my hand, mostly empty now, good for maybe one more burst. Not much of a weapon against an army of monsters. But then I remembered something Mike had said on our first day, back when he was still human. The old logging roads all connect eventually. Follow them downhill and they'll lead you out of the mountains. Logging roads, like the one that had brought us into this nightmare in the first place. I turned away from the pit and searched the cliff face, looking for any sign of human construction. There, barely visible in the moonlight, a narrow cut in the rock that might have been a trail. It was dangerous, possibly impossible to navigate in the dark, but it was my only chance. The howling was directly behind me now. I could hear individual voices in the cacophony, including the ragged screech of the not Mike calling my name. I started down the trail. The path was treacherous, little more than a series of narrow ledges carved into the rock face. One wrong step would send me plummeting into the pit below, but I forced myself not to look down, to focus only on the next handhold, the next footfall. Above me, the creatures had reached the cliff edge. I could hear them moving along the rim, searching for a way down. Some of them were already beginning to descend, their elongated limbs giving them advantages I didn't have. The trail curved around a rock outcropping, and suddenly I could see lights in the distance. Real lights, electric lights, the glow of civilization. It looked impossibly far away, but it was there. I wasn't lost forever in this nightmare realm. I moved faster, taking risks I never would have considered in daylight. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. They were gaining on me, their inhuman anatomy allowing them to navigate the cliff face with spider-like agility. The trail began to level out, becoming an actual logging road carved into the mountainside. I broke into a run, no longer caring about stealth or caution. The lights ahead grew brighter, resolving into the glow of a small town nestled in the valley below. A hand grabbed my ankle. I fell hard, my chin striking the rocky ground and filling my mouth with blood. Above me, the not Mike crouched on the trail, its transformation now complete. It was barely recognizable as having once been human, a pale, emaciated thing with too many joints and eyes like mirrors. "You can't run from what you're becoming, Jimmy," it said in Mike's voice, though its mouth didn't move correctly with the words. "I can smell the change on you. Feel it in your blood." It was right. The hunger was stronger now, a gnawing emptiness that made my stomach cramp. Part of me wanted to go back, to join the things in the pit, to become something that never felt pain or fear or loneliness. But Mike, the real Mike, would never have given up. For all his faults, all his jealousies and resentments, he'd been the kind of person who finished what he started, who protected the people he cared about. I owed it to his memory to keep fighting. I kicked upward with my free foot, catching the creature in what might have been its solar plexus. It doubled over with a wet, gasping sound, loosening its grip just enough for me to wrench my ankle free. I scrambled to my feet and ran again, and this time I didn't look back. The road led steadily downward, winding back and forth across the mountainside. The lights below grew larger and brighter, resolving into individual buildings, street lamps, the warm glow of windows. I could see cars moving along roads, the reassuring signs of normal human activity. I ran until the road met a paved highway, until I could flag down a passing truck whose driver took one look at my torn clothes and bloody face and immediately called 911. The search for Mike lasted 3 weeks. They found our campsite at Hancock Brook. They found the abandoned logging road. They even found the cliff. But they never found the pit. When I led them back to the exact spot where I'd seen it, there was nothing but a normal valley filled with normal trees. They never found Mike either, though they did find scattered pieces of his equipment spread across several miles of wilderness. The official conclusion was that he'd fallen from the cliff and his body had been scattered by scavengers. I never told them the truth. Who would believe it? But I know what really happened. And sometimes, late at night when the hunger gets too strong to ignore, I can feel them calling to me. The pale things in the pit, the creatures that wear human faces, the not Mike that still carries my friend's voice, they're waiting for me to come back. And the worst part, the part that keeps me awake at night fighting against the growing darkness in my mind, is that part of me wants to go. The transformation never stopped, you see. It just slowed down when I left their territory, but it didn't stop. I can feel myself changing day by day, thought by thought. The hunger grows stronger, and my reflection in the mirror becomes a little more wrong each time I look. My eyes are starting to reflect light in the dark, and sometimes I catch myself tilting my head at odd angles, the way the not Mike used to do. I've been back to New Hampshire twice now, telling myself I'm looking for closure, for some way to save Mike or stop what's happening to me. But I know the truth. I'm scouting for prey. The thing they turned me into, it's a patient hunter. It knows how to wait, how to plan, how to pick the right victims. And it's teaching me, whispering instructions in my dreams, showing me how to identify the hikers and campers who won't be missed, who will follow a friendly face into the deep woods without question. I've already picked out my first target, a coworker who's been talking about wanting to try backpacking, who trusts me enough to let me plan the route. His name is David, and he has no family, no close friends except for me. He'll be perfect. I know I should fight this, should find some way to resist the transformation, but the hunger is so strong now, and the promises they make, no more pain, no more loneliness, no more fear, are so tempting. Maybe it won't be so bad being one of them. Maybe Mike found peace in the change, relief from all the petty human concerns that used to torment him. Maybe I will too. But first, I need to feed. David's been asking about that camping trip again, and I think it's time to start planning our route. I know just the place, a beautiful valley in the White Mountains, near an old logging camp where the GPS signals fail and the maps don't quite match the terrain. He's going to love it there. We all are.